Chapter 340. Han Mingyue glanced at him indifferently and asked, "We are here for drunken butterflies' comfort. The Mahist army has nothing to do with us. Do you understand?" The gray-clothed man was slightly startled and immediately nodded. "This subordinate understands." "This subordinate doesn't know anything. Since we already know Miss Su's whereabouts, should we send people to rescue her?" A trace of hesitation flashed across Han Mingyue's face and he frowned. "Rescue her? Based on their past relationship, Prince Ding shouldn't hurt her. Then, it would be safer for her to stay in Suncreed City." The gray-clothed man said in a low voice, "But, according to the news from the governor's office, Miss Su isn't living very well there. A few days ago, she even injured her forehead. Also, the Ding King's consort seems to be very dissatisfied with Miss Su's former status as Prince Ding's fiancée. Now that Prince Ding doesn't care about the governor's office in Suncreed City, Miss Su might not be very well." "Princess Ding, Yi Li." Han Mingyue frowned. He had only met that Princess Ding a few times. But it seemed that every time they met, it wasn't pleasant. Even so, he couldn't help but envy his former good friend's good luck. Princess Ding was a very outstanding wife. She was even more suitable for Mo Xiaoyao and the Ding King's residence than Su Zuodi, who was the #1 beauty in Dechu State. Smart, sharp, strong, decisive, and at the same time, she had enough perseverance and courage. If she wanted to make things difficult for Su Zuodi, and Prince Ding didn't care at all. Su Zuodi wouldn't be able to win against Yi Li no matter what. Han Mingyue understood what kind of person the woman he adored was. In his dreams at night, he would even silently ask himself if everything he did was worth it. But send people to keep an eye on the governor's office. If there's any movement, report it immediately. This subordinate understands. The gray-clothed man respectfully lowered his head. Han Mingyue thought for a moment, then sighed and said, "Get ready. I will go to Xinyang personally." The gray-clothed man was startled, and said with some disapproval, "Young master, please reconsider. Now that the gates of Xinyang are closed, it will not be easy to enter or leave." Han Mingyue said firmly, "Go and prepare." "Yes, your subordinate obeys." Wang Fei, these days, the Xiling army is still stationed 20 li outside of Xinyang City. However, heir apparent of Genom of Gojoseon has secretly led close to 200,000 men south. It seems that he is preparing to rendezvous with the southern army. I speculate that Xiling might be planning to circle behind our army and attack Xinyang from both sides. Yi Li walked along the winding corridors of the governor's office as she listened to Zhuo Jing's report behind her. Hearing Zhuo Jing's words, Yi Li's brows furrowed slightly. She continued walking without stopping as she said, "Send a copy of the news to the prince. Has there been any movement from the Xiling soldiers outside the city?" Zhuo Jing said, "These days, there has been no movement outside the city." "What is Genom of Gojoseon doing?" Yi Li asked. Zhuo Jing frowned deeply and said, "These days, the Xiling army has not moved. There has been no news from Genom of Gojoseon." Yi Li paused and thought for a moment before saying, "Send someone to investigate whether Genom of Gojoseon is in the army. Also, tell the prince to be careful in Jiangxia. Lei Tingfeng may not be leading troops south to attack Xinyang." "Yes." Zhuo Jing nodded and said, "These days, that person in the side courtyard has been making a lot of noise. Princess, how do you think we should deal with her?" Yi Li glanced at a small courtyard in the northwest corner. She could not see anything as she walked along the corridors. However, these days, Su Zuodi had been making a fuss in the courtyard, wanting to go out. Yi Li knew about this. She smiled faintly and said, "If she wants to make a fuss, then let her." "Is there any news from Han Mingyue?" Zhuo Jing nodded and said, "Yesterday, we received news that Han Mingyue's Tianyi Pavilion was found in a small town near Xinyang. However, by the time we got there, they were already gone." Princess's deduction was correct. Han Mingyue is near Xinyang. Yi Li thought for a moment and smiled. Perhaps he has already entered the city. As long as he has entered, we will not have to worry about not being able to find him. Xinyang is not the same as it was before. Originally, Xinyang City had a large population and a mix of good and bad people. However, now, other than the military, there were not many ordinary citizens in Xinyang City, not to mention the merchants who came and went. It would not be easy for Han Mingyue's group to hide their tracks. Be careful in the governor's office. Don't let anyone break in and take them away. As soon as you discover the whereabouts of Han Mingyue's group, immediately seal off Xinyang City. Only entry and exit are allowed. Han Mingyue wouldn't think that it would be so easy to enter Xinyang City now, would she? If she had not left someone behind to walk right into the trap, not even a fly would be able to enter Xinyang City. Zhuo Jing smiled. Princess, please do not worry. We may not be as good as Han Mingyue, but it would not be easy for Han Mingyue to take someone from our hands. Yili nodded and stood in front of the door to her new study. She said to Zhuo Jing, "Go and do your work." Zhuo Jing bowed and left. Yili stepped into the room and saw Mo Xiaoyao sitting behind the desk, reading. She asked in surprise, "Why are you here?" Mo Xiaoyao had been extremely busy these past few days. The two of them had not seen each other for 2 days. Mo Xiaoyao put down the book and laughed lightly. "What? Does Princess Li not want to see me?" Yili glanced at him. "I had Zhuo Jing deliver something to you, but you're here. Didn't he make a wasted trip?" Mo Xiaoyao stood with a smile and pulled her to sit down. "It's I's fault. If there's anything important, Princess Li can just tell me. It's rare for me to have some free time to come see Princess Li." Yili rubbed her forehead and looked helplessly at the files on the table. "Prince still has time to have some free time, but I'm too busy." Mo Xiaoyao looked at the things on the table and frowned. He asked worriedly, "Why are there so many things? Princess Li doesn't have enough people by her side. Why don't I send a few more people to you?" Yili waved her hand. "No need. You're also very busy. There are many things waiting to be done in Suncreed City. It'll be fine after a while. I reckon that Han Mingyue will have some results in a few days. By then, NC should be back. I have enough people by my side." Mo Xiaoyao pulled her into his arms and muttered with some dissatisfaction, "If I'd known that Princess Li was so good at training people, I would have forgotten to send a few female guards to Princess Li." Yili raised her eyebrows. "Is Prince jealous? My wife is wise." Mo Xiaoyao laughed softly. Yili snorted softly. "Prince is getting better and better. Now he's even jealous of the people by my side." Mo Xiaoyao sighed with some resentment. He didn't want to make himself seem like a resentful husband, but Princess Li was getting more and more dazzling. The time he spent with her was obviously less than the time he spent with Zhuo Jing and Qin Feng. Most importantly, Princess Li hadn't said that she loved him. Zhuo Jing and the others were going to get married soon. "If you're too busy, then let second brother come over to help you." Yili rolled her eyes. Second brother came in the name of supervising the army. What's wrong with him following me? I'm not worried about second brother. Mo Xiaoyao said quietly. Chapter 341. Within an ordinary residence in Xinyang City, Han Mingyue sat on a bamboo couch with a gloomy face, looking at the gray-clothed man kneeling on one knee. "What did you say?" The gray-clothed man's face showed no signs of fear, calmly replying, "Reporting to young master, our men are completely unable to get close to Miss Su." Han Mingyue waved his hand, and the porcelain on the table fell to the ground, shattering into pieces. Trash! I don't believe that in just a few days, Princess Ding would be able to surround the governor's mansion so tightly that not even a drop of water could escape, leaving you with no openings at all. The gray-clothed man pondered for a moment before saying, "Princess Ding seems to have a unique way of arranging her guards. 2 months ago, all the countries had gathered their men, but they were still unable to completely break into the Ding mansion. I think, with our current manpower, it is impossible to safely take Miss Su away from the governor's mansion." Han Mingyue said in a low voice, "Then get more men. Even if we have to get all the men from the northwest, we must save Drunken Butterfly." The gray-clothed man frowned slightly and said, "Young master, please reconsider. If too many people suddenly appear in Xinyang City, I'm afraid it will arouse Princess Ding's suspicions. At that time, it will be even more disadvantageous for Miss Su." Han Mingyue closed his eyes and sighed softly, "Forget it, I'll leave it to you. If you need any men, go ahead and pick them. You must ensure Drunken Butterfly's safety." The gray-clothed man hesitated for a moment, then nodded and said, "I understand." Han Mingyue frowned and asked, "Has there been any news from the governor's mansion?" The gray-clothed man said, "Other than a serving maid, Princess Ding does not allow anyone to get close to Miss Su. I've sent men to get close to that maid, but that maid is extremely loyal to Princess Ding, and will not help us get close to Miss Su. But I've managed to get some information from her. Miss Su's head is indeed injured, and although a doctor has been called to treat it, I'm afraid it will leave a scar. And Miss Su has been calling for help these days, but the courtyard is surrounded by the Prince Ding Mansion's shadow guards. I'm afraid Miss Su is." Han Mingyue's eyes flashed with a trace of heartache, and waved his hand, "Enough. Quickly save Drunken Butterfly. Yi Li. If you hurt her, don't blame me for being merciless." In the West Hill barracks, Genom of Gojoseon looked at the news he had just received. He was no longer as gloomy as he had been a few days ago. He was obviously in a good mood. Why isn't Han Mingyue here yet? Looking at the information in his hand, Genom of Gojoseon's eyes flashed with determination as he asked the attendant beside him. The person standing at the side was startled for a moment before replying to the prince, "Young Master Han arrived a few days ago." Genom of Gojoseon frowned and asked, "Why didn't he come to see me when he arrived?" Regarding Han Mingyue, Genom of Gojoseon actually didn't think highly of Genom of Gojoseon. Betraying his homeland, friends, and brothers for a woman, not only would such a person not amount to much, in Genom of Gojoseon's eyes, there was also a limit to the amount of trust he could give him. If not for the fact that Han Mingyue's Tianyi Pavilion was indeed a force he desperately needed, Genom of Gojoseon wouldn't have paid any attention to him at all. Replying to the prince, "Young Master Han. Young Master Han didn't come to the barracks. I heard that he went directly to Xinyang." Bang! Genom of Gojoseon slammed the table and stood up. His imposing face was filled with anger. The attendants in the tent were so frightened that they all knelt on the ground, not daring to say a word. Genom of Gojoseon sneered and said, "Han Mingyue. I only thought that he was arrogant because of his talent, but it turns out that he's a fool." Prince. Prince? The attendants who followed Genom of Gojoseon were naturally his trusted aides. They were well aware of Han Mingyue's identity. Although the prince despised Han Mingyue's character, he had always praised his talent. Where did the word "fool" come from? Genom of Gojoseon sneered and said, "Does he think that it's so easy to enter Xinyang City? I'm just afraid that he won't be able to come out." The attendant was startled and asked tentatively, "Your Highness, should we inform young Master Han?" Jinan Wang sat down again. He lowered his eyes and pondered for a moment before saying, "Han Mingyue, this person, humph. He'll be killed by a woman sooner or later. Forget it, I'm afraid it's too late to inform him now. Send someone to deal with the Tianyi Pavilion's men in the northwest. I'm afraid something bad will happen." The attendant hesitated for a moment before reporting truthfully, "The Tianyi Pavilion has always been under young Master Han's sole control. Other people don't have young Master Han's official seal, so they don't know the details of the Tianyi Pavilion. I'm afraid. Bastard, send someone into the city. No matter what, you must bring Han Mingyue back alive." Genom of Gojoseon's face darkened as he said coldly, "Yes, Prince." Young Master Han rashly entered the city because of Bai. Imperial concubine, what if? Don't worry about it. I just want Han Mingyue to come back alive. Otherwise, his Tianyi Pavilion will be ruined. Bai Long was beautiful, but in the eyes of someone like Genom of Gojoseon, the value of a beauty was not as high as power. Since Bai Long was no longer of any use to him, he naturally had to rescue Han Mingyue, who was more valuable. If Bai Long died, Han Mingyue and Emo Xiaoyao would be mortal enemies. This was also in line with the benefits he needed. I understand. Xinyang City. In a secluded courtyard in the governor's mansion, Su Zuodi sat in front of the window with a gloomy face, lost in thought. She was proud of her peerless beauty. Over the years, her flower-like beauty had mesmerized many heroes, nobles, and emperors. She went from being the daughter of a government official in Dechu State whose parents were both dead, to being the fiancée of the second son of the Prince Ding Mansion, to being the daughter of the Bai family of Xiling, and finally becoming the imperial concubine of Xiling. She had never doubted her beauty. But now, it was because she was too confident in herself that she was imprisoned in this small courtyard. She used to think that even if Emo Xiaoyao blamed her for leaving him behind when he was seriously injured, as long as she came back and apologized to him, Emo Xiaoyao would definitely forgive her and be overjoyed. But she remembered that day in the study, when she crashed into the pillar, she saw Emo Xiaoyao's indifferent expression. There was not the slightest ripple in his calm eyes. It was as if the person in front of him was not someone who was about to die from crashing into a pillar, but an ordinary servant reporting to him. At that moment, she clearly understood one thing. Emo Xiaoyao did not care about her. He would not be captivated by her beauty, nor would he feel pity for her. But because of this, the love she had always hidden in her heart grew even stronger. She was madly jealous of Yili. That man should have been hers, and the position of Princess Ding should have been hers. But now, she was imprisoned here by Yili, unable to move. "Miss, it's time to eat." A servant girl walked over with a light meal and said carefully. This beautiful Miss Bai was not easy to serve. These days, the maidservants who served her had already deeply realized this point. "Get out. Tell Yili that if he doesn't let me out, I will starve to death here," Su Zuodi said harshly. The servant girl raised her head to look at her, then immediately lowered it again and said in a small voice, "The princess said, even if Miss Bai starves to death, the prince will not blame her. So, if Miss Bai doesn't want to eat, then forget it. Miss Bai, don't be angry with the princess." Chapter 342. Impossible. Su Zuodi got up and fiercely glared at the cautious maid in front of her, saying, "Xiaoyao wouldn't do this to me. I want to see Yili, tell her to come out and see me." Looking at the beautiful and crazy woman in front of her, the maid was so scared that tears welled up in her eyes. "Miss Su. Princess is very busy. You should eat quickly. This servant will leave it here." After saying that, she put the food on the side table and ran out as if there was a man-eating monster behind her. Su Zuodi looked sideways at the food on the table. There were 4 simple side dishes, a soup, and a bowl of rice. There were no exquisite ingredients, no superb cooking, and even the knife skills were ordinary. At a glance, she could tell that it was a home-cooked meal for ordinary people. Su Zuodi had been living a life of luxury all these years. No matter what, the best always belonged to her. How could she take a fancy to such things? With a wave of her hand, she waved all the food to the ground. The maid had just run out when she heard the noise inside and hurriedly came back. Looking at the mess on the ground, she said helplessly, Miss Bai." Su Zuodi raised her chin and said coldly, "How can I eat such lowly things? Go change it and make it again." The maid said awkwardly, "But now everyone eats like this." "Impudent." Su Zuodi said angrily, "Do you know who this young lady is? You actually dare to make me eat this kind of thing. But His Highness and Princess Consort also eat these. Miss Bai, these dishes are very delicious, you are too wasteful." Now that the Xiling army was besieging the city, although there was enough food in the city, the vegetables were gradually becoming scarce. Even the prince and princess only had to eat a simple meal every day. They didn't even have to cook for Miss Bai. Su Zuodi was so angry that her face turned blue. After getting along with this maid these days, she already somewhat understood her. She looked as timid as a mouse and would cry after saying a few words, but sometimes she was so stubborn that it drove people crazy. And she couldn't even punish her, because once she acted excessively, the guards outside would come in to stop her. Su Zuidi, who was quite angry, snorted and said, "Get out." The little girl carefully glanced at her and then respectfully retreated. Miss Bai was still angry, so it was better to come in later to clean up. She was the only one left in the room. Su Zuidi looked at the mess of food on the floor and felt irritated. She hadn't eaten anything after throwing a tantrum in the morning and at noon, so she was indeed a little hungry now. Thinking of the suffocating days, she gritted her teeth and returned to her room. "Yi Li, you better not fall into my hands. Otherwise, this imperial concubine will make you beg for death." "Drunken butterfly," an extremely soft call came from the corner. Su Zuidi was startled and turned around to look. Unknowingly, Han Mingyue had appeared in the corner behind the window. Su Zuidi stared blankly for a moment, then suddenly came back to her senses and cried out in surprise, "Mingyue." Han Mingyue shook her head, indicating for her to lower her voice. Su Zuidi came back to her senses and looked out the window vigilantly. She went up and closed all the half-closed windows. She turned around and said angrily to Han Mingyue, "Why are you only here now? Do you know how badly I've been bullied?" Han Mingyue looked at the floor and said with a helpless and bitter smile, "Sorry, you've been wronged." Han Mingyue carefully looked at Su Zuidi and let out a sigh of relief in her heart. Although she had lost some weight, she didn't seem to have been tortured. The wound on her forehead wasn't very obvious either. Even if there was a scar left in the future, it wouldn't be to the extent that it would affect her appearance. When Su Zuidi saw Han Mingyue's arrival, she only revealed a look of joy for a moment, but she quickly restrained her smile and said, "Did you bring the purple stamen dew?" Han Mingyue frowned and said, "Princess Ding didn't give you any medicine? Does your wound still hurt?" The mention of Yi Li clearly touched Su Zuidi's bottom line. She flicked her sleeves and said angrily, "Don't mention that slut." Han Mingyue sighed and took out a delicate little porcelain bottle from his chest and handed it to Su Zuidi. Su Zuidi took the porcelain bottle and sniffed it, then turned with satisfaction and went into the room to apply the medicine in front of the bronze mirror. Han Mingyue followed her into the bedroom. Looking at the simple furnishings in the room, she understood where Su Zuidi's anger towards that little girl came from. She had never been able to endure hardships since she was young. No matter what was slightly inferior, she wouldn't settle for it. But now she was locked up in this simple and crude place by Yi Li. It would be strange if she was in a good mood. After applying the medicine, Su Zuidi was finally in the mood to turn around and look at Han Mingyue. She was satisfied to see a trace of infatuation and adoration in his eyes. This made her confidence recover a lot from the setbacks and blows she had suffered here these past few days. Slightly raising her head, Su Zuidi asked softly, "Mingyue, are you here to save me?" Han Mingyue's expression changed slightly. She sighed and nodded, "If not to save you, why would I come here? I've arranged for people to receive us outside. We can leave here in a little while." Su Zuidi was startled. She hesitated for a moment and shook her head, "No, we can't leave like this." Han Mingyue frowned, "What else do you want here?" Su Zuidi gritted her teeth and said, "Yi Li. That slut. Help me kill her." Han Mingyue's smile was somewhat forced and bitter. He looked deeply at Su Zuidi and tried to reason with her, "Zuidi, I promised. I won't do anything to Yi Li again. Not only because of Mo Xiaoyao, but also because of Han Mingxi." No matter how much Han Mingyue was infatuated with Su Zuidi, Han Mingxi was still his only blood brother. He was the closest person to him by blood in this world. He was well aware of his brother's feelings for Yi Li. Although he knew that it was only Han Mingxi's wishful thinking, Han Mingyue knew that if he really did anything to Yi Li, Han Mingxi would definitely not forgive him. He had never really thought of becoming enemies with the little brother he had raised since childhood. Su Zuidi's expression changed and she sneered, "Promise. Another promise. I knew that in your heart, I'm nothing. Since that's the case, why do you still care if I live or die? I don't need you, young Master Han, to save me. Even if I'm killed by Yi Li, it's my own fault. You can leave by yourself. Don't worry about me." "Zuidi." Han Mingyue said in a low voice, now is not the time to be willful. It's already good enough that we're able to get out safely. It's impossible for us to touch Yili. You should also understand these days that Imo Xiaoyao will not stand on your side. Su Zuidi choked when her sore spot was hit. She also understood that Han Mingyue was right. But she was unwilling to let Yili go just like that. She rolled her eyes and looked at Han Mingyue, saying coquettishly, so you're saying that you'll help me teach her a lesson when you have the chance in the future, right? Han Mingyue was startled. What he meant was that he wanted Zuidi to stop provoking Yili. But it was clearly not the time to reason with her. He could only nod perfunctorily and say, there will be a chance in the future. Su Zuidi smiled sweetly and lowered her eyes, saying, I knew that only you, Mingyue, treat me the best in this world. How could she not tell that Han Mingyue was patronizing her? But it didn't matter. As long as Han Mingyue agreed, she would always have a way to make him do as she said. Su Zuidi had always had unlimited confidence and means when it came to Han Mingyue. Chapter 343. If you want to deal with this consort, why do you have to pick a time? Isn't this consort right here? A faint and lazy laugh came from outside. Han Mingyue's heart shook and he became alert. He hadn't noticed that someone had entered the reception pavilion outside. Yili smiled faintly and said, Young Master Han, it's been a long time since we parted in Guangling. Does young Master Han not want to come out and catch up? Han Mingyue lowered his head to look at Su Zuidi. He smiled reassuringly at her and said softly, Don't be afraid, nothing will happen. Let's go out and take a look. Passing through the screen and out of the room, Yili was sitting lazily on a soft couch in the reception pavilion. She looked at the two people in front of her with a smile. Seeing Han Mingyue, she smiled and said, Young Master Mingyu has good methods. It seems that Xinyang City and the governor's manor are free for young Master Mingyu to come and go as he pleases. If Han Mingyue still didn't understand, he wouldn't be the head of the Tianyi Pavilion who controlled the world's intelligence network. He smiled bitterly and said, I'm afraid that Princess Ding has been merciful. If Princess Ding had such a capable subordinate, how could she have allowed him to enter the governor's manor for so long without noticing? She had probably set up a net long ago and was waiting for him to walk right into it. Yili smiled and said softly, Young Master Mingyu is deeply affectionate and can be called the saint of love. This consort admires you greatly. Since noble consort Bai is here, how could young Master Mingyu not come? Han Mingyue heard the mockery in Yili's words. He smiled faintly and didn't reply. Yili propped her chin up with her hand and looked at the two indifferently. Originally, this consort shouldn't have made things difficult for young Master Han out of respect for Mingxi. But the current situation is a bit special, so I have no choice but to offend you. Han Mingyue raised his hands in a greeting and said with an easy smile, landing in Wang Fei's hands, Han Mingyue accepts wholeheartedly, and will be at Wang Fei's disposal. Yili nodded slightly. Looking at the man in front of her who was as elegant as ever, she felt a thread of regret. Han Mingyue was not lacking in family background, appearance, ability, and means. In fact, she was much better than ordinary people. It was no wonder that he was able to become Mo Xiaoyao's good friend in his youth. It was a pity that even though he was supposed to be a genius, he had fallen to his current state because of love. Han Mingyue did not have an easy time in West Hill. Even if he had a powerful force like the Tianyi Pavilion, as long as he could let go of Su Zuidi, he would be able to live a carefree life wherever he went. However, he was entangled with Su Zuidi. The royal family of West Hill did need the power in his hands, but they treated him as an outsider and guarded against him. He even eyed the power in his hands covetously. Other people's things were not as convenient as his own, was it not? Take young Master Han away. Yili waved her hand and said softly. Han Mingyue looked at her with a smile and said, Is Prince Ding not coming out to meet an old friend? Yili looked at him indifferently. Does young Master Han think that Prince still has time to meet a friend? Han Mingyue pondered for a moment and nodded slightly to show that she understood. He frowned and asked, I understand why Wang Fei is putting in so much effort. If I give you what Wang Fei wants, what does Wang Fei plan to use in exchange? Yi Li stared at Han Mingyue for a long time before she laughed softly and said leisurely, "Does young Master Han think that I plan to make a deal with you?" Han Mingyue raised her eyebrows, indicating that was exactly what he meant. Yi Li said regretfully, "Originally, if young Master Han came directly to make a deal with me, I would indeed agree. But now, it took me a lot of effort to make young Master Han stay. If it is an equivalent exchange, I feel that I am losing out. Moreover, I can still get what I want without making a deal with young Master Han." Han Mingyue frowned, disbelief written all over his face. "That is impossible. If the Tianyi Pavilion can be controlled so easily, then I don't need to be here anymore." Yi Li shook her head and said, "To be honest, I have no interest in the Tianyi Pavilion. Even if young Master Han gave it to me, do you think I would dare to use it?" Han Mingyue stared at the elegant and graceful woman on the seat with vigilance. It seemed that from the first time they met, he had never guessed this woman's thoughts correctly. This made him feel even more inexplicably uneasy. Yi Li said indifferently, "Since I can't use it, then my suggestion is to destroy it." Han Mingyue took a deep breath, shock finally appearing on his handsome face. "You want to destroy the Tianyi Pavilion?" The Tianyi Pavilion was something that many heroes and even emperors coveted. Having it in their hands was equivalent to having the Tianyi Pavilion in their hands. Yet, the woman in front of him wanted to destroy it without even blinking an eye. "In fact, I am already destroying it," Yi Li said indifferently. Han Mingyue closed his eyes. When he opened them again, there was only silence in his eyes. "You have people in the Tianyi Pavilion." Yi Li smiled appreciatively and clapped her hands lightly. A man in gray walked in from outside and calmly glanced at Han Mingyue and Su Zuodi, who was beside him. Then, he respectfully bowed to Yi Li and said, "Subordinate and Si greets Princess." Yi Li smiled and nodded, saying, "Rise. You have worked hard these days." And Si respectfully said, "Subordinate is unable to fulfill Princess's orders." Yi Li said, "You have done well, just like Zhuo Jing and Lin Han. From today onwards, you are no longer a shadow guard." And Si bowed again and said, "Subordinate Wei Lin greets Princess." On the side, Han Mingyue's face was ashen. He looked at Wei Lin and said indifferently, "You are the shadow guard of the Prince Ding mansion?" Wei Lin stood and looked at Han Mingyue, saying, "That's right. I have troubled Pavilion Master to take care of me these days." Han Mingyue's smile was bleak. Didn't he take care of him? In less than half a year, he had promoted an unknown person to his most trusted right-hand man. Of course, it was because the other person had once risked his life to save him, but it was also because he admired the other person's talent and ability. He powerlessly turned his head to look at Yi Li and said, "I didn't expect the shadow guard of the Ding mansion to be so outstanding. Or is it the people around Princess that are especially outstanding?" He had once been close friends with Mo Xiaoyao and naturally had some understanding of the shadow guard of the Prince Ding mansion. However, Wei Lin's abilities and methods were far superior to the shadow guards. In the beginning, he had suspected that Wei Lin was a spy sent by Genom of Gojoseon or the Bai family of Xiling, or even the Emperor of Xiling or other powers. But in the end, it was proven that he had no relationship with any of these people. So he had given his trust, but he had never thought that he was a person of the Ding mansion. Yi Li smiled and said, "Young Master Han is too kind. Ask young Master Han to leave. Maybe the prince will have time to chat with young Master Han. Young Master's people in the northwest. Young Master doesn't have to worry about them. Isn't it useless to worry about them?" Han Mingyue was speechless. After a long time, he said, "Princess is wise." Han Mingyue admits defeat. Yi Li smiled faintly and did not speak. She waved her hand to have people take him down. Looking at the two guards who were walking towards him, and then looking at the people standing beside Yi Li, Han Mingyue sighed and did not try to resist. Instead, he allowed himself to be captured. When it did not involve Su Zuodi, Han Mingyue had always been a smart person. Of course, He knew that in the situation in front of him, even if he resisted, it would be futile. Looking at Su Zuidi apologetically, Han Mingyue said softly, "Zuidi, it seems that we will have to stay in the governor's residence for a few more days." Su Zuidi gritted her teeth and stared hatefully at Yi Li, who was sitting leisurely. She glared at Han Mingyue and said, "You have never succeeded in anything. No wonder the prince said that you are unable to do anything right." Chapter 344. Han Mingyue lowered her head bitterly. Yi Li looked at the two people in front of her and sighed, "Is it worth it? Since I've already made my choice, there's no such thing as whether it's worth it or not." Han Mingyue said indifferently. She cupped her hands at Yi Li and turned around to let the guards take her away. Yi Li calmly looked at the stunning woman in front of her. After the initial amazement, and after experiencing the various forms Su Zuidi had taken these days, she gradually became indifferent to that stunning face. Yi Li looked at her and slightly raised the corners of her mouth. The most beautiful woman in the Chu state was nothing more than this. Her appearance was indeed blessed by the heavens, but she seemed to lack a feeling of reluctance. Perhaps what one wanted was always the best. The world remembered the world-famous stunning beauty in the Chu capital, and Su Zuidi's early death had shrouded her beauty in a mysterious veil. But when such a stunning woman really appeared in front of them, they couldn't help but feel a faint sense of loss. The most beautiful woman in the world was nothing more than this. Su Zuidi was clearly aware of Yi Li's scrutinizing gaze, if at first she was secretly pleased with herself. Gradually, when she noticed that Yi Li's gaze revealed a kind of disapproval, she couldn't help but feel angry. After enduring for a long time, she finally couldn't help but angrily rebuke, "What are you looking at?" Yi Li calmly withdrew her gaze and said indifferently, "Imperial concubine Bai, is there anything else? If there's nothing else, go back to your room and rest. This concubine will take her leave." Su Zuidi snorted and turned to go back to her room. Yi Li smiled faintly and also got up and walked out. Qin Feng and the others followed behind her. Yi Li asked while walking, "How is it outside?" Wei Lin said, "Princess, please rest assured. All the forces of the Tianyi Pavilion in the northwest region have been wiped out in one fell swoop." Yi Li nodded with satisfaction and said with a smile, "Although Prince tried to remove many of the Tianyi Pavilion spies, there were still many who escaped. Originally, it didn't matter, but now that the two countries were at war, the existence of this force in the northwest was a headache." Wei Lin lowered his head and smiled faintly, "This is your subordinate's duty." Zhuo Jing patted Wei Lin's shoulder and laughed, "Xiao Si, you don't need to be modest. Wang Fei is right. If it wasn't for you, we would have to spend a lot of effort to catch Han Mingyue. But the most important thing is that you're finally back. Us brothers can be together again. It would be even better if Boss was back." Wei Lin raised his head and glanced at Yi Li. Yi Li smiled and said, "If you have something to say, say it." Wei Lin said, "I met Big Brother once 2 months ago." Yi Li raised her eyebrows slightly, indicating for him to continue. Wei Lin said, "I originally planned to use the Tianyi Pavilion's power to investigate the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce and Sickly Scholar. Later, I received some scattered information and found an excuse to go to the border and happened to meet Big Brother. But according to Wang Fei's orders, I didn't acknowledge him and didn't say anything." Yi Li nodded and said, "It seems that Yi did a good job." Wei Lin smiled faintly and said, "I think so too. Thanks to Wang Fei's guidance, I saw that Big Brother was already a captain." Zhuo Jing clicked his tongue and said, "Although a captain's rank isn't high, Big Brother was able to reach this level in just a few months. He's worthy of being called Big Brother. Maybe in 2 years, Big Brother will become a general." Qin Feng, who was born in the Black Cloud Cavalry, sneered, "Stop dreaming. It might not be difficult to be promoted from an ordinary soldier to a captain, but to be promoted from a captain to a general is more than 1 or 2 steps. Don't even think about it if you don't take 8 to 10 years. Feng Sangongzi has been following the prince through fire and water since he was a teenager and now he's only a deputy general." Zhuo Jing didn't care at all, a deputy general is still a general. Can you be promoted to a captain in 2 or 3 months? Qin Feng was silent. He really couldn't. Yi Li smiled and stopped the war of words between her subordinates. She said with a smile, "Don't worry about an E for now. Have the guards at Han Mingyue's place been arranged?" Qin Feng replied respectfully, replying to Wang Fei, "It has been arranged. It's just that, this subordinate doesn't understand. Why haven't I seen Han Mingyue and Su Zuidi locked up together? If they're separated, a lot of soldiers will be wasted. Right now, we don't have enough soldiers guarding the governor's office." Yi Li's clear eyes curved slightly and she said with a smile, "What if they're put together and they're wiped out? Don't worry, if I were Genom of Gojoseon, I wouldn't send people to save Su Zuidi. So, the people on Su Zuidi's side can be a little more careful and put them at Han Mingyue's side to set up hidden sentries." Seeing that her subordinates didn't understand, Yi Li said with a smile, "If Genom of Gojoseon really cares about Imperial Concubine Bai, why would he let her come to Xinyang alone? Imperial Concubine Bai has been imprisoned by us for so long. Have you seen any movements from Genom of Gojoseon?" Everyone suddenly understood. Then Han Mingyue's side, Yi Li smiled even more happily, "Without saving Su Zuidi, even if I let Han Mingyue go now, he won't leave." Qin Feng finally understood. Wang Fei wants to use Su Zuidi to control Han Mingyue. Yi Li sighed helplessly, "You can say that. Keep an eye on Su Zuidi. She can't die yet." Reporting to Prince. "We have lost contact with young Master Han." In the tent of the Shilin camp, a subordinate reported respectfully. Genom of Gojoseon's weasel hairbrush paused slightly, "What about the Tianyi Pavilion?" The subordinate hesitated for a moment, then said, "We also lost contact with the Tianyi Pavilion last night. According to what I saw, I'm afraid it's not good." Genom of Gojoseon closed his eyes, seeming to calm the anger in his heart, but his calm voice still contained traces of murderous intent. "Pass down my order. Other than the soldiers and horses besieging Xinyang, all the soldiers and horses are to attack all the cities in the northwest with full force. I want Xinyang to become an isolated city." "Yes, sir." Seeing that his subordinates had left, Genom of Gojoseon's calm face became gloomy. He gritted his teeth and said, "Han Mingyue, you idiot." Compared to the furious Genom of Gojoseon, Han Mingyue appeared to be calm and leisurely at this moment. Mo Xiaoyao stepped into the courtyard and saw Han Mingyue sitting leisurely by the window, alone and entertaining herself with an incomplete chess game. Hearing the footsteps, she smiled without raising her head and said, "Ayao, how about a game of chess?" Mo Xiaoyao walked over and sat down. He picked up a black chess piece and casually placed it on the table. Han Mingyue raised her eyebrows with interest and placed the white chess piece in her hand. Mo Xiaoyao's expression was calm. He picked up a black chess piece and placed it down. The two of them played back and forth. In less than half an hour, the originally difficult game had become completely one-sided. Large numbers of white players died on the chessboard. Han Mingyue sighed and said, "Ayao's chess is murderous. You're getting worse and worse." Mo Xiaoyao said coldly. Han Mingyue did not care about her old friend's evaluation. She smiled faintly and said, "I'm not like you. I'm not born to be emotionless." "Emotionless?" Mo Xiaoyao smiled coldly and snorted at her words. He did not claim to be a saint of love, but he was not truly emotionless and cold-blooded. It was just that the person he cared for appeared too late. More importantly, he knew what it meant to do and what not to do. He also knew what kind of person was worth protecting and what kind of person must be abandoned. The Mo family never gave their feelings without principles. Thus, Mo Xiaoyao was not moved by Han Mingyue's infatuation. He only felt disdain. Chapter 345. I thought you weren't here to catch up with I. Mo Xiaoyao said calmly. Han Mingyue nodded and said, "You've already discovered Genom of Gojoseon's plan?" Mo Xiaoyao didn't answer, only looking at him calmly. Han Mingyue smiled and said, "Now that I'm in your hands, you don't have to be so guarded against me. Now that all of Xinjiang is in the hands of Princess Ding, as the prince of the state, you naturally have to do something more important. I've thought about it, and this is the only thing more important than the current siege of Xinjiang. But I'm a bit curious. Since you already know, why haven't you made a move? Looking at Imo Xiaoyao, who was silently playing chess, Han Mingyue muttered to himself for a moment, then suddenly said, "Is it because of Imo Jingqi? I originally thought that Genom of Gojoseon had only contacted Imo Jingli and Nanzhao. I didn't expect that Imo Jingqi would also be involved. In that case, you should be more careful. Perhaps even the northern tribes will come to join in the fun. Xiaoyao, I'm beginning to wonder how you're going to break Genom of Gojoseon's sure-kill plan." Imo Xiaoyao smiled coldly and said, "Since you know so much, you should know that I didn't come to find you to play chess." Han Mingyue smiled lazily and said, "I didn't tell Genom of Gojoseon what you already know. Isn't that enough?" Imo Xiaoyao looked at him calmly. Han Mingyue shrugged helplessly and said, "The Tianyi Pavilion's influence in the Chu state has been scattered by you. This time, I came back with the intention of tidying it up. Even if you take it now, it's useless." Imo Xiaoyao smiled coldly and said, "I don't need the Tianyi Pavilion." Han Mingyue was startled, looking somewhat puzzledly at Imo Xiaoyao. She only heard Imo Xiaoyao apathetically say, "This prince doesn't dare to use the things that were taken from the hands of a traitor." Han Mingyue smiled bitterly. Sure enough, birds of a feather flock together. It's exactly the same as what Princess Ding said. Then what do you want? Imo Xiaoyao said, "I want the Tianyi Pavilion to disappear from this world." Han Mingyue was shocked, and the chess piece in her hand fell onto the chessboard with a bang, disrupting the original game. Looking up at Imo Xiaoyao's cold and calm face, Han Mingyue shook her head and smiled bitterly. "Xiaoyao, it's fine if you don't make a move, but once you do, it's earth-shattering. Do you know how much trouble it will cause if the Tianyi Pavilion disappears?" The Tianyi Pavilion wasn't a nameless gang or a small chamber of commerce. Instead, it was known as the world's #1 intelligence organization. Even though its influence in the Dechu state was greatly damaged after Imo Xiaoyao attacked it with all his strength, it was still not something an ordinary organization could compare to. Once the Tianyi Pavilion disappeared, it meant that the hidden powers in the world would be reshuffled. The room was silent. Only the sound of Imo Xiaoyao leisurely placing the messy chess pieces back on the chessboard could be heard. When Han Mingyue thought that Imo Xiaoyao wouldn't answer, she heard him say indifferently, "So what?" Han Mingyue smiled helplessly. Indeed, so what? Even if the Jianghu court was in chaos, what did it have to do with the Ding King's estate? Moreover, because the Tianyi Pavilion's influence in the Dechu state had declined, the Dechu state would receive the least impact. The Ding King's estate could even take the opportunity to plant their own people there. Han Mingyue put her hand to her forehead and thought for a while before raising her head to look at her former good friend. "What benefits can I get?" Imo Xiaoyao smiled coldly. "I let you live. Isn't that a benefit?" Han Mingyue was speechless. He always thought that Imo Xiaoyao wouldn't kill him out of habit. However, he always forgot that the moment he chose to betray Imo Xiaoyao, their friendship was no longer the same as before. Looking at the calm and indifferent Imo Xiaoyao in front of him, Han Mingyue suddenly understood. If she didn't agree, Imo Xiaoyao really wouldn't show any mercy to her. Shrugging helplessly, Han Mingyue said, "I don't seem to have a choice." Imo Xiaoyao calmly looked at the chessboard in front of him. Han Mingyue frowned and asked, "How do you want to deal with Drunken Butterfly?" Imo Xiaoyao's originally calm expression finally changed. He frowned slightly and disgust was clearly written on his handsome face that wasn't covered by the mask. "This is Li's business. I have no interest in knowing." In his words, he had completely handed Su Zuodi's life over to Yi Li. "You really don't care about Drunken Butterfly at all?" Han Mingyue stared at him and asked in a low voice. Imo Xiaoyao raised his head to look at her, a faint mockery flashing through his eyes. "If I really cared about her, do you think you would still be alive now?" It was because he didn't love Su Zuodi that he let them go when Su Zuodi and Han Mingyue left him together. He even helped them deal with the aftermath. But he didn't expect that Su Zuodi and Han Mingyue's departure together was just an excuse to stop his anger. After leaving the Chu capital, Su Zuodi abandoned Han Mingyue without hesitation and went straight to Xiling. Then she became the daughter of Xilings by family and the imperial consort of Xiling. From the beginning to the end, Han Mingyue was just the one being used. Han Mingyue looked enviously at Imo Xiaoyao and smiled faintly. Sometimes I really envy you. We could be said to have known each other since we were young. I liked Drunken Butterfly almost from the first time I saw her, but her gaze always followed you. And you? To be honest, I've never realized that you really cared about anyone or anything before. Except for the Ding King's estate and your father and eldest brother. Imo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows. Are you complaining that I didn't treat you well enough back then, which led to your betrayal? The word betrayal made Han Mingyue's expression change slightly. Betraying his best friend and brother in this life was an indescribable guilt in his heart. He shook his head slightly. No, the second young master of the Ding King's estate is elegant and carefree. Towards his friends, he is chivalrous and righteous. But Xiaoyao, do you know, from the beginning, I knew that you didn't like Drunken Butterfly. At this point, Han Mingyue suddenly smiled as if he thought of something. Seeing Imo Xiaoyao's gaze, Han Mingyue smiled even more happily. You treat Drunken Butterfly very well. You give her all the good things. Whatever she wants, as long as it is reasonable, you will definitely get it for her. You are different from the other sons of aristocratic families. You never linger around and never look at other women. For example, that equally famous imperial consort Lu. But, you also never seriously looked at Drunken Butterfly. That kind of beauty, in your eyes, seemed to be no different from any other ordinary woman in the world. When Feng San, when almost all of us were struggling in love at that age, you were completely detached from it, as if you weren't a person of this world. At that time, I was thinking, I might not have no chance. Imo Xiaoyao recalled the frivolous youth of 15 or 16 and couldn't help but reveal a trace of nostalgia. Maybe it's because I didn't meet that person. If you had told me directly at that time, and Su Zuodi had agreed, I would have helped you. Thinking back to the past, Imo Xiaoyao couldn't help but admit that Han Mingyue was right. Towards Han Mingyue openly revealing that he had thought of his fiancée, he didn't feel angry. As long as it wasn't his Li, as long as the other party also agreed, he didn't feel that helping a pair of lovers would make him feel that he had lost face. Of course, Han Mingyue and Su Zuodi were impossible. Because the one Su Zuodi wanted from the beginning was never Han Mingyue. He might really be heartless, but that was because he hadn't met the one he wanted. Chapter 346. But I forgot, even if it wasn't you, it might not be me. Han Mingyue's words revealed a trace of pain and conflict. When he took the woman he admired for many years away from Jing with mixed feelings of guilt and joy, he found that betraying his good friend was not the most painful moment of his life. It was when he found that the woman he admired was not the person he had imagined, and he could only be trapped and unable to extricate himself. I really envy you. Xiaoyao, let Zoe die live. I beg you. What does young Master Han plan to use in exchange for Su Zoe Dai's life? Yi Li's voice was clear and melodious as it sounded outside the door. Imo Xiaoyao put down the chess piece in his hand and walked to the door. Holding Yi Li's hand, he asked with a lowered head, how come you have time to come here? Yi Li smiled faintly and glanced at Han Mingyue. It seems that in Genom of Gojoseon's eyes, young Master Han is much more valuable than the most beautiful woman in the world. Han Mingyue grimaced, Wang Fei is joking. Doesn't Wang Fei also understand? I won't run away. Yi Li looked sideways at Han Mingyue and sighed, what is love? If it wasn't for the special situation now, Ben Fei really couldn't bear to make things difficult for young Master Mingyue. Han Mingyue lowered his eyes and didn't speak. Had he fallen to the point where he needed other people's pity? What does Wang Fei want this one to use in exchange? This one just made a deal with the prince and now I have nothing. Han Mingyue spread his hands and looked at Yi Li with a smile. Yili pursed her lips and said with a smile, "These words, do you believe, young Master Han? Even a crafty rabbit has 3 burrows. Young Master Han is a smart person, how could he place all his bets on Tianyi Pavilion?" Han Mingyue's smile faded slightly. She took a deep look at Yili, who had a gentle smile on her face. She sighed and said, "Xiaoyao is really fortunate to be able to marry a princess." Yili smiled faintly, "Thank you for your auspicious words." Han Mingyue was speechless. She took out a jade pendant and threw it over, saying, "Since Wang Fei is so confident, then this, you should know how to use it." Yili was clearly very satisfied with the jade pendant in her hand. She smiled slightly and said, "Han Gongzi is truly generous. Since young Master Han is like this consort is not a petty person. When the siege of Xinyang is lifted, young Master can naturally take young Miss Su away." After getting the reward she wanted, Yili no longer kept calling Su Zuo imperial concubine Bai to annoy Han Mingyue. Han Mingyue raised her eyebrows and asked, "Why not now?" Yili's smile was kind and innocent, "I am thinking for young Master Han. Of course, if young Master Han is in a hurry to leave, this consort will not stop him." Han Mingyue was silent for a long time before she raised her hands in salute and said, "Then I will have to trouble Wang Fei." Leaving Han Mingyue's courtyard, the two walked hand in hand. Mo Xiaoyao lowered his head to look at Yili, who was playing with the jade pendant in one hand. He asked softly, "Why did Miss Li release Han Mingyue and Su Zuo?" Yili was startled. She raised her eyebrows and said, "Didn't the prince not plan on taking their lives?" Mo Xiaoyao snorted softly and said, "What are their lives worth? Whether he wants it or not, it's just a matter of words." Yili sighed in her heart. Fine, she had misunderstood. She had thought that Mo Xiaoyao did not have the heart to take Han Mingyue and Su Zuo's lives, but it was not easy to speak. After being together for so long, how could she have thought that Mo Xiaoyao was such an indecisive person? As expected, she had been influenced by Su Zuo, right? For Mingxi's sake, it's better to keep Han Mingyue alive. Since we have kept Han Mingyue alive, we can't not keep Su Zuo. Otherwise, I'm afraid that Han Mingyue will really turn against us. Su Zuo is the best weapon to contain Han Mingyue. Thinking about it, Yili laughed softly and said, "Besides, we have received enough compensation. These things are more than enough to buy Han Mingyue and Su Zuo's lives, right?" Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows. Looking at the jade pendant in her hand, he asked curiously, "What good things have made Li so happy?" Yili laughed, "Don't you want to know where the Tianyi Pavilion's money has gone all these years? Han Mingyue is known to love money as much as his life. How could he not have enough money? But whether it's the current Han family or the Tianyi Pavilion in Dechu State, we didn't find much money, did we?" Mo Xiaoyao looked at the jade pendant with some surprise. "Han Mingyue's property?" Yili laughed, "Not only money, but also food, cloth, weapons, and medicinal materials. Han Mingyue is indeed Han Mingyue. When it comes to making money, he is much better than Mingxi. It's a pity, his brain has to go crazy from time to time." Speaking of this, Yili was not without regret. In this world, among all the people she had met, including Ling Haoyu and the Feng family, no one had the means to make money like Han Mingyue. When she saw the results of Wei Lin's investigation, she also couldn't help but feel pity. If Han Mingyue hadn't been burdened by Su Zuo, she wouldn't have minded cooperating with him. Now that the cooperation had failed, she would just sit back and reap the rewards. Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows. Han Mingyue wants to make money during the chaos of war? To be able to tempt Li, one could imagine how much resources Han Mingyue had hoarded. In the chaos of the world, those with foresight don't have to worry about not being able to make a fortune. Yili laughed. Mo Xiaoyao nodded and said, "Since Li said so, it doesn't matter if they stay. However, you'd better have people keep an eye on Su Zuo." Yili looked at Mo Xiaoyao in surprise. Mo Xiaoyao lowered his head and laughed. "I know that Li thinks that Su Zuo doesn't have any ability, right? In fact, without Su Zuo, Han Mingyue wouldn't be a threat at all, right?" Does Li Li understand what I mean? Yi Li nodded. I understand. I'll have people keep an eye on Su Zuidi. She had indeed looked down on Su Zuidi, intentionally or unintentionally, but Mo Xiaoyao was right. If Su Zuidi didn't have any ability, how could she have controlled Han Mingyue for so many years? After reaching an agreement, Yi Li generously gave Han Mingyue a certain degree of freedom. At the same time, for Han Mingyue's sake, she didn't let people keep an eye on Su Zuidi and confined her to that small courtyard. Han Mingyue was a smart person and naturally knew what was best for himself and Su Zuidi. Genom of Gojoseon did indeed value Han Mingyue, but that was because of the power and wealth in Han Mingyue's hands. And now, Han Mingyue, who had nothing, would only become a cannon for Genom of Gojoseon to vent his anger. As for Su Zuidi, Han Mingyue also knew that neither Mo Xiaoyao nor Yi Li would give her too much patience. So if Han Mingyue wanted Su Zuidi to live well, the best way was to watch over her. Yi Li's mood didn't become better after achieving victory against Genom of Gojoseon once again. Because she was very clear that the current situation was still very unfavorable for the Ding Palace. Looking at the generals coming in and out of Mo Xiaoyao's study every day, Yi Li knew in her heart that once again, they would have to say goodbye. 3 days later, the news of Jiangxia being besieged once again came. Mo Xiaoyao quietly looked at the graceful woman sitting beside him, his eyes filled with deep regret and reluctance. The 700,000 Mahist army was already on standby, but for the first time in his life, he hesitated before embarking on an expedition. He had never hated Mo Jingqi's selfish and despicable methods so much. If he could, he wished that no matter where he went, he could have his Yi Li by his side. Yi Li looked at the rare childish man in front of her with some amusement. She reached out and rubbed his handsome face, softly saying, "You should set off. Don't worry, whether it is Xinyang, Jiangxia, or the entire northwest, I will guard it for you." Chapter 347. Mo Xiaoyao reached out and pulled her tightly into his embrace. The man who had never cried before felt his eyes grow wet and hot, but he did not want his wife to discover his weakness at this moment. Sometimes, love did not need to be expressed with words. Sometimes, there were words and things that could express its meaning better than the word itself. Yi Li pursed her lips and smiled faintly. She raised her hand to return his embrace. "You don't trust me?" Mo Xiaoyao shook his head. "In this world, if I can't even trust Li, then who can I trust? If that's the case, then don't worry and do what you need to do." Yi Li held his shoulder and raised her head to speak seriously. She was not the type to cling to others. Even if she did not want to separate, she knew that there were some things that had to be done. Since that was the case, she would protect this vast land in the northwest for him, so that he would no longer have to worry about anything. The burden that the heavens had placed on this man's shoulders was already heavy enough. Since she had chosen him, then let her share some of his burden. "Li, when this war is over, no one can let you leave my side." Mo Xiaoyao gritted his teeth and kissed the fragrant lips of the person in his embrace fiercely. They kissed deeply until both of them were out of breath. Yi Li laughed softly. "I won't stay under your wing forever, Mo Xiaoyao. If I've decided on someone, then I want to stand shoulder to shoulder with him." Mo Xiaoyao trapped her in his embrace and said unhappily, "You've never hidden under my wing. But I look forward to the life I'll walk shoulder to shoulder with Li." After sending off Mo Xiaoyao, Yi Li stood on the city gate tower of Xinyang and gazed at the departing figure in the distance. Mo Xiaoyao did not take Xinyang's soldiers with him because Xinyang, like the entire northwest, was facing hundreds of thousands of strong enemies. Only Lu Jingxian and a few other generals followed him to the new battlefield. Feng San, who had always been by his side and could be considered his most trusted aide, was left behind in Xinyang. Han Mingyue stood at a corner of the city gate tower, looking at the elegant woman standing by the battlements of the city wall and gazing into the distance. An extremely complicated look flashed in her eyes. It was as if he was envious, relieved, and disappointed. Prince Ding is not worried at all. Han Mingyue sighed softly as she walked to Yi Li's side. Yi Li glanced at him and said with a faint smile, I am his wife. If I can't make him feel at ease, who else can? Han Mingyue raised an eyebrow and asked with a smile, this time is different from that time in Yonglin. Genom of Gojoseon is not kingly. Is Wang Fei not afraid at all? Yi Li turned around and looked at him with a shadow of a smile, if being afraid can solve problems, then I am very afraid. Finished speaking, she did not pay attention to what Han Mingyue wanted to say. She said to Feng San standing not far away, send people to support General Yuan Pei. Also, disperse the army to various parts of the northwest. Xinjiang does not need so many people. Feng Zhiyao frowned slightly and said with some disagreement, Wang Fei, if we disperse the army, I'm afraid it will not be good for defending Xinjiang. Yi Li said lightly, who said we are defending Xinjiang? What we need to do is to keep Genom of Gojoseon and his hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the northwest so that he has no time to mess with the prince. As for Xinjiang, other than the Mahist army, how many citizens are there in the city? Chaos was about to break out. How many people would pay attention to this northwestern town? From now on, the Central Plains is the most important stage in the world. Feng Zhiyao was silent for a moment. He then raised his hands and said, this general obeys. Seeing Feng Zhiyao turn and leave, Han Mingyue smiled and sighed. Feng San has always been proud. Other than Xiaoyao, he would not listen to anyone. I didn't think that he would be completely convinced by Wang Fei. Not only Feng Zhiyao, even he was shocked by the courage and decisiveness of the woman in front of him who was not even 20. He finally understood why the cold-hearted Mo Xiaoyao would value this Princess Ding so much. This kind of woman was enough to intoxicate the heroes of the world. Watching Yi Li walk down the tower, Han Mingyue looked at a certain place in the tower and said lightly, do you understand the difference between you and her now? In the shadows, Su Zuidi silently walked out. Her beautiful face was filled with darkness and unwillingness. It was not just because of Mo Xiaoyao's trust in Yi Li, but also because she clearly knew that she did not have Yi Li's ability and courage. Seeing Yi Li calmly command the army and give orders, she envied and even yearned to have that kind of power. But she also knew deep in her heart that she did not have that kind of power. Just like how she, who had been raised in the boudoir and fought all over the palace, could not understand every order that Yi Li gave. She snorted unwillingly and said, so what? Han Mingyue was speechless. After a moment of silence, she said, let's go. When the war ends, we will leave here. Don't do anything unnecessary. If you anger Princess Ding, even I cannot save you. Su Zuidi gritted her teeth and glared at Han Mingyue for a moment. In the end, she did not say anything. Mo Xiaoyao's departure meant that the temporary peace in Suncrete City was no longer there. On the city gate tower, the Mahist army soldiers were waiting in formation. They were extremely vigilant against the Xiling army that was eyeing them like a tiger watching its prey. In accordance with Yi Li's orders, Feng Zhiyao had secretly sent most of the Mahist army out of Suncrete City. Genom of Gojoseon may or may not have discovered it. Or perhaps he thought that a Suncrete City without many guards was more in line with his interests. Almost every day, there were large and small battles outside Suncrete City. But the Xiling army that had been unstoppable before had never been able to step into the city gates like last time. The news from all over the northwest and the Mahist army that seemed to have suddenly spread throughout the northwest made Genom of Gojoseon frown even though he had received the news that Mo Xiaoyao was surrounded by nearly 800,000 soldiers. He had already understood the true intentions of the woman who appeared on the city gate tower from time to time and indifferently looked down at the bloody storm below. But at this time, he could no longer withdraw. If he did not completely take down the northwest, his plan to encroach on the Central Plains would be foiled. What made him even more furious was that even the news of Mo Xiaoyao being surrounded by a large number of soldiers did not cause the woman in the city to lose her composure in the slightest. While occasionally mocking Mo Xiaoyao for marrying such a cruel and heartless wife, he could not help but secretly speculate on what kind of woman she was. On the city gate tower, Yi Li had finished dealing with military and government affairs as usual. She climbed up the city gate tower and gazed at the billowing banners of the Xiling camp in the distance. Wang Fei. Feng Zhiyao climbed up the city gate tower. Looking at the slender and gentle figure of the woman in front of him, he couldn't help but sigh inside. Only people like him, her trusted aides, knew what kind of pressure and burden this young woman was shouldering. At the same time, the woman's tenacity and decisiveness caused the entire Mahist army to be even more convinced. Because she was Yi Li, and not because she was Princess Ding. Yi Li turned her head and smiled faintly. Feng San, is something the matter? Feng Zhiyao frowned as he looked at her slightly pale face. He said worriedly, Wang Fei's body does not seem well these days. Should we have a doctor take a look? Yi Li shook her head and said, I'm just a little tired. If Xiling Genom of Gojoseon was so easy to deal with, then he would not be called the war god of Xiling. I am also very nervous. Chapter 348. Feng Zhiyao looked at her and smiled. I can't tell that princess is nervous. We were able to hold back most of Xiling's troops and Genom of Gojoseon in the northwest, reducing at least 1/3 of the prince's forces. Princess's contribution cannot go unnoticed. 1/3. Yi Li thought for a moment and asked, how are things on prince's side? Feng Zhiyao hesitated for a moment but still answered truthfully, although all the Mahist army is under prince's control. But right now, Xiling, Nanzhao, and Prince Li are all in trouble. Prince only has 500,000 troops. The three sides are unable to cope with the enemy. Moreover, we still have to guard against the one in the capital. Right now, how many people does Prince have to deal with? At least 800,000. Feng Zhiyao said in a low voice. Yi Li laughed coldly. It's not guarding against his tricks. He has already made his move. Nanzhao is a small country. Their total forces do not exceed 300,000. In the south, Mo Jingli has to guard against Mo Jingqi. At most, he can only squeeze out 200,000 troops. As for Xiling, Lightenfeng also has no more than 200,000 troops. Feng Zhiyao's expression changed slightly. Right now, there is no news of Dechu State's troops participating in the battle. That is to say, Mo Jingqi has at least 100,000 troops hidden in the dark. Yi Li closed her eyes and sighed. Mo Jingqi has made up his mind to destroy the Prince Ding mansion and the Mahist army. Hearing Yi Li's words, Feng Zhiyao's expression twisted. After a while, he gritted his teeth and said, Mo Jingqi. Prince is too soft-hearted. I've already said that he doesn't want the Dechu State's territory. Why should we care so much? Let's send troops to the capital and see what other tricks he has. Yi Li shook her head and sighed. If we touch Mo Jingqi now, it will only make our situation more difficult. No matter how dark and vicious Mo Jingqi was, he was not a licentious and incapable ruler. The people in this world were deeply influenced by the secular world. There were definitely many people who were loyal to the royal family. There was also the saying, if the monarch wants the subject to die, the subject has no choice but to die. If the Mahist army suddenly fell out with Mo Jingqi now, it would only drag the other garrisons who were not involved into this complicated battle. If someone else were to take advantage of this opportunity, not only would the Dechu state be finished, but the Mahist army would also be finished. It wasn't that Feng Zhiyao didn't understand what Yi Li was saying. It was just that he couldn't calm the anger in his heart. What should we do now? Yi Li looked up at the blue dome of the sky and said in a low voice, stop Genom of Gojoseon at all costs. We definitely can't let him interfere in the Central Plains war. Feng Zhiyao's heart trembled slightly. Looking at the thin but upright figure in front of him, he understood what she meant by stop at all costs. The one they were going to fight was Genom of Gojoseon, who was known as the god of war in West Hill, as well as the Xiling army that could be continuously replenished from West Hill. The Mahist army that remained in the northwest only had 200,000 soldiers. As you wish. Letting Feng Zhiyao leave, Yi Li couldn't help but frown. Her body had become extremely tired these days. It was only the end of September. She had just stood on the city wall and felt a gust of wind, but now she was feeling slightly dizzy and uncomfortable. Normally, anyone would feel unwell, but right now, she couldn't fall down so easily. With one hand on the city wall, she lowered her eyes and waited for the waves of dizziness to pass. Yili raised her head and rubbed between her brows. She couldn't help but feel irritated. "You're not feeling well?" Han Mingyue's voice came from behind her. These days, Han Mingyue had been very well behaved. Other than having people secretly keep an eye on him, Yili didn't pay attention to him. Han Mingyue was also very obedient. Most of the time, he stayed in his courtyard or chatted with Su Zuidi. She didn't know what he said to Su Zuidi, but these days, Su Zuidi had been very well behaved and didn't make any noise. Turning her head, she saw Han Mingyue standing not far away and looking at her with some worry. Yili said lightly, "It's nothing, I'm just a little tired." "Why did young Master Han come up?" Han Mingyue looked her up and down. He came forward and said, "If Wang Fei trusts this one, why don't you let this one take a look at you?" Yili tilted her head to look at him and said in surprise, "Young Master Han knows medicine?" Han Mingyue gave a faint smile and said, "A little." He stepped forward and took one of Yili's hands to feel the pulse. Yili didn't struggle and just looked at him silently. Han Mingyue felt the pulse and frowned. He raised his head to look at Yili and then took the pulse again. After a while, he sighed and let go of Yili's hand. Yili looked at him and said with a smile, "Young Master Han's expression, does Ben Fei have an incurable disease?" Han Mingyue shook his head and looked at Yili with a complicated expression as he said, "I don't know if this is good news for Wang Fei." Yili gave a faint smile and indicated that no matter what the news was, she could accept it. Han Mingyue said in a heavy voice, "Wang Fei is pregnant, not even a month old yet." Yili stilled. Her mind seemed to go blank and she seemed to think of many things. Han Mingyue's words had a great impact on her. Even though she had lived 2 lifetimes and experienced things that normal people wouldn't experience even in 10 lifetimes, but having a child was still the first time in her life. She hadn't prepared to have a child yet. Even if she was safe, in her original plan, having a child should only happen after she turned 18. But now, this child had come at the wrong time. But in her heart, she couldn't help but feel a strange excitement and joy. She was pregnant, this child was her and Mo Xiaoyao's first child, and it would be her closest blood relative. Han Mingyue silently observed Yili's expression. He watched as shock, suspicion, joy, and worry flashed across that beautiful face before slowly turning to determination. He instantly understood what decision Yili had made. Looking at her slender figure, Han Mingyue said sincerely for the first time, "Wang Fei, this child probably came at the wrong time." Yili stared at his face. After a long silence, she said, "Can this Fei assume that young Master Han will not tell anyone other than you and me about this matter?" Han Mingyue said with a worried frown, "Wang Fei, you should know that the present situation does not allow you to keep this child. If the prince was here, he would also think the same." Yili shook her head and said, "You're wrong. Xiao Yao is the same as me, he will choose to protect this child." Han Mingyue said, "That is because Xiao Yao is by your side, he can protect you. But right now, you are a woman leading an army of hundreds of thousands, and you are also pregnant. If there is any accident, I think that Xiao Yao will definitely not be willing to use your life to exchange for the life of an unborn child." Yili lowered her eyes and looked at her still flat stomach. She said indifferently, "This Fei knows what to do. Many thanks for young Master Han's concern." Han Mingyue still wanted to persuade her. He understood Mo Xiaoyao, and he also understood Mo Xiaoyao's feelings for Yili. If something happened to Yili because of this child, he didn't dare to imagine what kind of reaction Mo Xiaoyao would have. But when he saw the determined expression on Yili's beautiful face, he closed his mouth in the end. He had seen many things that a mother could do for a child over the years, and Yili was the most determined woman he had ever seen. How could she listen to his advice? Sighing, Han Mingyue promised, "Without Wang Fei's permission, I will not tell anyone about this matter. But Wang Fei should immediately find a doctor to take a look." Medicine to protect the baby and tonics are essential. Chapter 349. Many thanks. Returning to the study, Yili leaned against the desk in a daze. The sudden news that had just arrived still made it hard for her to recover. Her calmness and composure in front of Han Mingyue was just a habitual disguise. After thinking for a long time, she raised her hand to gently caress her flat stomach that had not changed at all. Yi Li's clear face became even gentler. This place actually had a child that she and Mo Xiaoyao shared. People who had never been a mother would never understand how wonderful this feeling was. Maybe in a few more months, she would be able to feel the change in him and feel the baby kicking and punching in her stomach. A faint smile appeared on her lips and the expression between her brows became even more determined. Someone come. The one who came in was Wei Lin. He walked to the door and respectfully said, "Wang Fei. Go get a doctor." Wei Lin stilled and said worriedly, "Is Wang Fei not feeling well?" Yili shook her head and said, "Go." Thinking that Yili was not feeling well, Wei Lin did not care about anything else as he turned and flew out. Not long after, he dragged in a youth that was only in his 20s. Looking at the excessively young doctor in front of her, Yili raised her eyebrows. In fact, the average age of the doctors in the army wasn't too old. After all, the hardships of marching wasn't something that those old doctors could bear. But the youth in front of her was a bit too young. No matter if she admitted it or not, Chinese medicine did not completely rely on talent. More often than not, it relied on experience. Wei Lin clearly understood Yi Li's doubts and went forward to explain, "Wang Fei, Dr. Yang is Mr. Chen's martial nephew. Mr. Chen also has high praise for his medical skills. These 2 years, he has been at the Black Cloud Cavalry in the northwest. This time, he has followed the Black Cloud Cavalry to stay in Xinyang City." Yili nodded and smiled apologetically at the youth, "Since it's like this, Dr. Yang, please take my pulse." Obviously, it was not the first time that the young doctor had encountered other people's doubts about him. He did not care and went forward to sit down. He took out the pulse pillow and placed it properly to feel Yili's pulse. A long while later, the young doctor's furrowed brows relaxed. Standing, he raised his hands to Yili and said, "Congratulations, Wang Fei. This subordinate sees that Wang Fei is pregnant." Wei Lin was stunned when he heard this, and he was at a loss for what to do. If Wang Fei was pregnant normally, the Prince Ding mansion and the entire Mahist army would rejoice. But now that she was pregnant, it meant that Wang Fei and little Shizi's comfort could not be completely guaranteed. Yili lowered her eyes and muttered in a low voice, "I really do." The youth nodded his head with certainty and said, replying to Wang Fei, "This subordinate is certain." Yili looked at him and asked, "Do you need me to prescribe any medicine?" The young man shook his head and said, "Princess Consort's health is very good, and her pulse is also very good." There was no need for any pregnancy-stabilizing medicine among his subordinates. Since it wasn't necessary, there was no harm in avoiding it. But the necessary tonics are still needed. Also, in the first few months, Wang Fei must be extra careful and not affect the fetus. The first few months? Then in the future? After 3 or 4 months, the fetus will be stable and there won't be any major problems. But at the same time, you still have to be careful and safe. Also, after 4 or 5 months, Wang Fei may not be able to move freely. When he said this, the young doctor couldn't help but become worried. He wasn't a doctor who sat at home all day and didn't care about anything. As a military doctor who followed the army, he naturally knew how dangerous the battlefield was and how many unpredictable accidents there were. Looking at Yili, he could only say, "Please be careful, Wang Fei." Yili nodded and said, "Ben Fei knows." Would it be all right for Dr. Yang to stay in the governor's office for the next few days? The young doctor raised his hands and said, "It is this subordinate's honor to be able to take care of little Shizi. This subordinate will obey. Thank you for your trouble, doctor. Please keep this matter a secret from me." Other than the people by Ben Fei's side, Ben Fei does not want anyone else to know. Although the young doctor didn't understand, he still agreed and said, "This subordinate will list the tonics and give them to Wang Fei's people." "Many thanks. Wei Lin, send Dr. Yang out." "Yes." Wang Fei. Feng Zhiyao blew in from the outside like a gust of wind. His usually carefree and unrestrained face was covered in a rare fine sweat. His cynical and elegant face had also turned pale due to nervousness. Yili raised her head to look at him. She asked with a smile, "What is it?" Feng Zhiyao lost his composure and pointed a finger at her. He quickly pulled it back, but his face still looked like he was having trouble digesting. "You, Wang Fei, you really?" "That's right." Not used to his trembling appearance, Yili generously nodded and admitted, "Yes, I'm pregnant." "How can it be like this?" Feng Zhiyao looked like he had been struck by lightning. He looked pitifully at Yili. Yili couldn't help but feel embarrassed. She helplessly put down the brush and said, "Prince and I have been married for more than a year. What's wrong with having a child?" Feng Zhiyao was silent. What was wrong with a married couple having a child? Of course there was no problem. But right now, the two armies were at war, and the general of one army had a child. Was this considered a problem? With a sad face, Feng Zhiyao sighed, "Little Shitzi, you really didn't come at the right time. It would have been good even if he had come a few days earlier. At least when the prince hadn't left, the prince would have known how to deal with this matter." Yili unconsciously rubbed her flat stomach. She laughed softly and said, "Even if it's not the right time, it's already here. What can I do?" Alright, it was indeed her fault that she didn't use contraception properly. "Feng San, do you have any suggestions? I need to immediately report this to Prince." That was Mo Xiuyao's child, the little Shitzi of the Ding Palace. How could he dare to have any suggestions? No. Yili shook her head and said, "At most, only Zhuojing and a few others know about my pregnancy. Among the generals, only you know about it. You can't spread it outside." Feng Zhiyao frowned, "Why is that?" Yili said helplessly, "Prince can't leave right now. Why should we distract him? Also, it won't do us any good if the news of my pregnancy gets out." Feng Zhiyao said worriedly, "But the safety of Princess Consort and the little Shitzi. I'm afraid we can't hide it for long." Yili thought and said, "I estimate that this war will end in at most 3 months. At that time, the child won't be 4 months old. As long as we are careful, there won't be any problems." Feng Zhiyao still wanted to persuade her but was stopped by Yili. It's already not easy for Prince to deal with the allied forces. If he has to worry about us, do you think it will do him any good? Feng Zhiyao looked at Yili's determined face and finally sighed softly. He said in a low voice, "This subordinate obeys. Princess Consort, please take care." "I understand." Yili nodded. At the end of September and beginning of October, the weather in the northwest had become cold. The occasional light rain and cold wind made the people living in the Chu capital feel the arrival of winter in advance. Entering winter, because of the various military provisions, the fodder for the military horses became scarce. The Shilin kingdom had never been rich in grain, so their grain reserves were naturally not very rich. Furthermore, they had not expected that this war, which they thought they were going to win, would end up in such a stalemate. Shiling's grain supplies began to show signs of being in short supply. In the middle of October, other than leaving some people to besiege Xinyang, Genom of Gojoseon had turned most of his troops to Hangzhou, which was known as the Granary of the Northwest. The Shilin soldiers also started their long-awaited pillaging. Wherever they went, they robbed the grain stores of the government, the crops that had not been harvested in time, and even ordinary villages. Chapter 350. When the news reached Xinyang, Yili was naturally enraged. In reality, she had experienced countless wars in both her previous and current lives, but she had never experienced a real war. But she knew about war. Because in her previous life, she had lived in a time of peace and prosperity that had not been separated from war for too long. Compared to Mo Jingli's rebellion, that could not even be considered a real war. Mo Jingli was a citizen of the Dechu state, and he was not crazy. Even when two armies were at war, he would not casually harm the common people. Because in Mo Jingli's heart, they were still his common people. But the people of Xiling were different. What they wanted was not only the vast land of the Dechu state, but also the food, gold, and silver on it. They would even do their best to destroy the people living on this land. Xiling was bitterly cold. They needed someone to vacate this vast and rich land for them. She could imagine what kind of suffering the people in the northwest were suffering, but she was powerless to do anything. Wang Fei. In the spacious study, the generals seated all had ugly expressions. Feng Xiao looked worriedly at Yi Li's tightly clenched hands and cold expression. He frowned and said, "Wang Fei, please calm down. This matter is not Wang Fei's fault." Yi Li snorted and glanced at the generals below. She said lightly, "If it's not my fault, then whose fault is it?" Everyone lowered their heads and said in unison, "We are incompetent. Wang Fei, please punish us." Yi Li lowered her eyes and sighed softly, "I am not in a position to punish you. I only hope that everyone will remember one thing. The Mahist army's duty is to protect the country. But now, the people of Xiling are wreaking havoc in the northwest. The common people have no way to make a living. Everyone, stand on the city walls and look out. Do you know what this is? This is the shame of the Mahist army. To let the common people who need your protection be abused by a foreign race is the shame of a soldier. At the same time, it is also the shame of the Ding kingdom." Everyone couldn't help blushing. Several young generals couldn't help but jump out. "Princess, please give the order. We are willing to be the vanguard to expel the West Hill bandits and shake the soul of our Mahist army." Yi Li shook her head and sighed. She picked up the booklet on the table and handed it over. "Take a look. How do you want to settle this debt?" After taking the booklet from Yi Li, everyone's expression changed after reading it. Genom of Gojoseon had sent reinforcements to the northwest. It was obvious that they wanted to eliminate the Mahist army in the northwest and then surround Prince's escape route. Over the past few days, the garrisons in the northwest had suffered significant losses. "Feng San, what do you think?" Yi Li asked. Feng San raised his head and looked at Yi Li, hesitating. Yi Li said, "Just tell me the truth." Feng San gritted his teeth. "I think we should abandon Xinyang." Everyone was in an uproar. Xinyang had been massacred and Prince had personally taken it back from the West Hill people. If they lost it again, the Mahist army would lose face. Yi Li's expression was calm. "Tell me the reason." Feng Xiao said, "Xinyang has 3 sides of flat land. It is easy to attack and hard to defend. Moreover, it is now an empty city. There is no point in defending it. Once the Xiling army takes over the 11 cities in the northwest, Xinyang will become an ancient city. At that time, even if we can take it for a few months, what's the point?" Yi Li nodded. "Continue." Feng Xiao walked to a large map hanging not far away. He raised his head and looked at it. Pointing at a certain place, he said, "This subordinate's opinion is to abandon Xinyang, seize the road from Li River, and reject Hangzhou. Hangzhou is the granary of the northwest. The terrain is complicated and steep. Even though the Xiling army is trying their best to open the road to Hangzhou, they are still met with setbacks. We are familiar with the terrain of the northwest. We can definitely reach Hangzhou before their main force arrives. We can also clear out the vanguard troops already there. In addition, Hangzhou is a stronghold. It is the gateway to the northwest. As long as we defend Hangzhou, even if Genom of Gojoseon has thousands of soldiers and horses, they will not be able to enter the central plains from the northwest." The study was silent. Everyone stared at the map as if thinking about Feng Xiao's words. Yi Li looked up at the crowd. "What do you all think?" After a long time, the young Yunting stepped forward and said, "I agree with General Feng's suggestion. I am willing to be the vanguard and open the road for the princess. Soon, more and more people seconded the idea. Looking at the excited generals, Yili nodded and said softly, I understand. Everyone, go back and prepare. No matter what kind of battle we will face, I hope that everyone will be prepared and have enough energy. Yes, Princess. The generals all took their leave. Only Feng Xiao, Zhuo Jing, and the others were left in the study. Feng Xiao looked at Yili and said in understanding, Princess also agrees with my suggestion. Yili smiled faintly and said, after delaying in Xinyang for so long, is Feng San anxious? Feng Xiao shook his head and said, I understand that Princess has her own considerations. Besides, Princess's current body is not suitable for long-distance travel. If they wanted to delay Genom of Gojoseon in the northwest and retreat to Hangzhou, they could not do it too early or too late. If they did it too early, Genom of Gojoseon would see through their intentions. If they did it too late, they could really bury the 3 prefectures and 11 cities in the northwest. Yili said, my body is fine. You can go prepare. There is one more thing that I need you to do personally. Feng Xiao saw that Yili was serious and his expression became serious. He said solemnly, please give your orders, Princess. Yili lowered her eyes and said, even if we retreat to Hangzhou, I do not want the people of West Hill to get a single grain of rice or grain in the northwest. Feng Xiao paused and said, Princess means, scorched earth. Yili said faintly. Feng Xiao was silent. Although he had never heard of this phrase, it did not prevent him from understanding what it meant. Feng Xiao's expression changed as he looked at the beautiful woman with a cold expression in front of him. He respectfully said, this subordinate accepts the order. You may leave. I will leave. Seeing Feng Xiao's figure disappear through the door, Yili closed her eyes tiredly. A faint trace of sadness appeared between her brows. Zhuo Jing looked at her and said in a low voice, my lady, the West Hill army is now burning and killing in the northwest. The people are already suffering. It is not your fault. Yili shook her head and smiled bitterly, but I am afraid that I have made their suffering worse. Once the West Hill army could not get their food, how could they not vent their anger on the common people? Zhuo Jing said, there are not many people left near Xinyang. Yili raised her hand and rubbed her forehead. She said softly, fine, go prepare. Even if we leave, we can't leave in vain. We have to leave some gifts for the people of West Hill before we leave. Qin Feng's eyes lit up. He stepped forward and said, Princess, I request to stay behind to cover the retreat. Yili looked at him and asked, what ideas do you have? Qin Feng smiled embarrassedly and said, I do have some ideas, but the secrets of heaven cannot be divulged. Yili's lips curled up slightly. She smiled and said, I happen to have some ideas as well. Why don't we discuss them together? It was not just Qin Feng. Zhuo Jing and the others also became spirited. Qin Feng said loudly, I will obey. Early October, after several days of relentless attacks, and more than a month later, the West Hill army once again aggressively charged into Suncrete City. However, this time, what greeted them was not a ground full of gold and silver, nor was there any food or military supplies. There wasn't even any panicking people. What appeared in front of them was a completely empty city. Other than the sounds they made, there was no other sound in the entire city. All the residents in the city had long since left. Not even a grain of food could be found in the empty houses. All of the shops had either been emptied or destroyed on the spot. Even the wells in the city had been thrown in with a lot of debris. It would take a lot of effort to refill them. Chapter 351. The leader of the vanguard rode on horseback with an ashen face as he stared at the empty city in front of him. General, there's not a single person left in the city, reported the soldier who had been scouting ahead. Bastard! The leader of the vanguard was furious. It wasn't clear if he was cursing the soldiers of the Dechu state or himself. After cursing a few times, he could only send someone to report to Genom of Gojoseon, who had yet to enter the city. What's that? asked the vanguard with a frown as he pointed at an inconspicuous black object at the corner of the street. The soldier standing in front of his horse went forward to examine it. After a while, he returned with some confusion and reported, "General, it seems to be some tung oil and tallow water. It probably fell when the Dong Chu people were fleeing." The vanguard's brows were tightly knit together as he felt that something was wrong. Looking around carefully, he discovered that there were many such traces. Moreover, the air seemed to be filled with the thick smell of alcohol. When they had first entered the city, there were several wine shops along the street, so they hadn't noticed. But now that they looked carefully, they discovered that the smell of alcohol was too strong even outside the wine shops. Before they had time to think about it, the window of a building beside the street was suddenly pushed open from the inside. A man dressed in black coldly glanced at the people below. He quickly knocked an arrow on his bow and then disappeared through the window. These actions were all completed in an instant. By the time everyone reacted and shot at the window, the man had already disappeared through the window. Fire! Suddenly, someone screamed. A cluster of sparks suddenly appeared on both sides of the street and spread out in an extremely short period of time. Ambush! Retreat quickly! At the same time, Xinyang City became noisy again. There's a fire at the city gates. A loud boom came from the city gates. Then, they saw flames shoot up into the sky. Even from their position in the city, they could clearly see the red light on the horizon. It was easy to imagine how fierce the fire was. Quick! Put out the fire! The Xiling army immediately fell into chaos. Putting out a fire was easier said than done. Xiling City was already dry and short of water. The few wells they had were either sealed or buried. The only liquid that could be found in the second city was wine. As if on purpose, these jars were placed outside the taverns. Some of them were even placed on the side of the street. As long as someone accidentally broke the jar, it would cause an even bigger fire. Suncreed City, which should have been filled with songs of victory, was now ablaze with flames and cries of agony. On a mountain peak several li away from Suncreed City, Yili gazed at Suncreed City in the distance, which had already become a sea of fire. She sighed softly, "Suncreed is destroyed." Qin Feng stood behind Yili and draped a thin cloak over her shoulders as he said, "Wang Fei does not need to worry." In reality, most of the buildings in Xinyang City are made of mud and stone. Even if most of the buildings are burned down, it won't be too difficult to rebuild them. Furthermore, we will be able to wipe out at least 50,000 of the Western Mausoleum's troops without sacrificing a single soldier. Rather than leaving Suncreed City for the Western Mausoleum to live in, it would be better to burn it down. Yili smiled faintly. Gathering the cloak around her, she turned and said, "Let's go." After this battle, Genom of Gojoseon's anger will not be small. We need to hurry to Hangzhou. Yes, Wang Fei. Suncreed City was indeed made of mud and stone as Qin Feng had said. It was not a good fuel. But even so, everyone had lost an entire day. Because the city gates were blocked by fire, the people inside the city could not leave, and the people outside the city could not enter. When the fire finally weakened on the second day, and the soldiers outside the city could enter, the people inside the city were almost completely wiped out. Even those who had not been burned to death by the fire had suffocated to death from the billowing smoke. The originally grand and magnificent Suncreed City was now pitch black, giving off a feeling of death. When Genom of Gojoseon stepped into Suncreed City, his expression could not be described as simply gloomy. It was completely sinister. Looking at the ruins in front of him, the smoke that had not completely extinguished on both sides of the street, and the foul smell in the air, Genom of Gojoseon's expression was ferocious and sinister. Gritting his teeth, he said, "Yili." The generals that followed Genom of Gojoseon in were all trembling in fear, afraid that they would say or do something wrong to anger the gloomy Genom of Gojoseon. After a long time, Genom of Gojoseon suddenly raised his head to the sky and laughed, "Good. Who would have thought that after 10 years, I would be able to meet an opponent? Mo Lufang, your good daughter-in-law. Yili, if I don't capture you alive, I swear that I am not human." Pass down I's orders, anyone who captures the king's consort alive will be rewarded with 10,000 taels of gold and the title of Marquis of 1,000 households. Hearing this, everyone was shocked. This kind of reward was almost comparable to the reward given to the founding princes of the past. Genom of Gojosian turned around and scanned the surroundings. With a cold laugh, he said, "Leave some people to guard Suncreed City. The rest of the army depart for Hangzhou." Yes. Hangzhou City. Hangzhou was not the largest city in the northwest, nor was it the most fortified city in the northwest. However, due to its geographical location, the Shilin army had been blocked by the Mahist army and had not been able to get close to Hangzhou City. Although the flames of war were raging in the northwest, the citizens and merchants of Hangzhou City were still very peaceful. This was because they were backed by the northwest, which was the only way to enter the central plains. Even if Hangzhou City was breached by the Shilin army, they still had time to escape to the central plains. Also, right now, the northwest was not the only part of the Dechu state that was at war. Therefore, there were fewer people fleeing. This subject is the Northwest Inspector General, Sun Xingji. I lead the officials and merchants of Hangzhou to welcome Ding Wangfei. At the city gates, the Hangzhou governor led the officials to welcome Yili and her group. Feng Xiao glanced at the middle-aged man who was full of smiles in front of him. This person could be considered part of the pro-emperor faction. When the war started, he had fled from Suncreed City to Hangzhou. He did not pay attention to the Mahist army near Hangzhou, and even thought of ways to delay the food that should have been provided. At this time, he still had the guts to stand at the city gates to welcome Wang Fei. He was very daring. Yili was dressed in plain blue robes. She did not have the elegance and grandeur of the noblewomen of the Chu capital. The hem of her robes was smooth. The simple and ordinary style did not cause people to be disrespectful. Holding Zhuo Jing's hand as she dismounted from the horse, Yili looked calmly at the 2 rows of people standing respectfully in front of her. She nodded slightly and said, "Official Sun, you are excused." Sun Xingji came forward and said with a smile, "Wang Fei must be tired from the journey. Please come into the city and have a cup of tea. At night, this subordinate will host a banquet to welcome Wang Fei." Yili's eyebrows rose slightly. Was he in such a hurry to announce the relationship between guest and host? I'm afraid I will have to reject official Sun's good intentions. The Shilin army is rampaging in Hangzhou. Does official have a solution? Sun Xingji smiled and said, "With the Mahist army present, there is no place for the Shilin people to do as they please. This subject is the same as the people of Hangzhou. This subject is very assured, very assured." At the side, Feng Xiao's eyebrows rose and he said with a cold smile, "Does official Sun only mean the people of Hangzhou? I remember that official Sun is the governor of the Northwest and not the governor of Hangzhou. In addition, Lord Sun's meaning just now seems to be that the West Hill people are wantonly raiding the Northwest, and it is the Mo army's fault." Sun Xingji's face stiffened, but he quickly smiled apologetically and said, "This official does not dare." Not daring did not mean that he did not dare. Feng Xiao snorted lightly and ignored him. Chapter 352. The atmosphere seemed to be slightly awkward. A middle-aged man standing behind Sun Xingji hurriedly stood up and said, "This official. Hangzhou's Governor Qi Anrong greets Wang Fei." Yili nodded and said, "Official Qi, this Fei heard that the provisions that were supposed to be supplied to the Mahist army in Hangzhou have not arrived. What is the matter?" Qi Anrong quickly glanced at Sun Xingji beside him and stammered, "This. Wang Fei, please forgive me. The Northwest has been raided by the Shilin people, and Hangzhou has suffered especially, so the provisions have been delayed for a few days. Wang Fei, please forgive me." Yili smiled faintly and said, "So it is like this. It has been hard on official Qi." Hearing Yili's words, Qi Anrong couldn't help but wipe the sweat on his forehead. His eyes that were slightly blue from excessive alcohol and women trembled slightly. He smiled apologetically and said, "I don't dare. I don't dare." Zhuajing looked coldly at the crowd and said, still not moving out of the way. Do you want Wang Fei to rest outside the city? Qi Anrong hurriedly moved out of the way and made a path. Wang Fei, please, Wang Fei. Yili was about to walk into the city when Sun Xingji's voice came from behind her. Wang Fei, please wait. Yili turned back and looked calmly at Sun Xingji. Her beautiful brows rose slightly as she waited with a smile for him to continue. Sun Xingji looked around and swallowed before he puffed out his chest and said, Wang Fei has come to Hangzhou. The officials and people of Hangzhou naturally welcome you. But the Mahist army cannot enter the city with Wang Fei. Yili smiled and asked, why? Sun Xingji said seriously, if so many people enter the city, it will cause chaos in the city. Wang Fei, please reconsider. Also, according to the laws of Dechu State, each city cannot have more than 50,000 soldiers. Wang Fei will only bring a few 100,000 people, right? Sun Xingji's voice grew louder as though he found he was in the right. Yili was not angry and only stared calmly at the smug middle-aged man in front of her. Seeing that Yili did not speak, Sun Xingji became even happier. Even the cautiousness he originally had was gone by 70 to 80%. He smiled and said, Wang Fei, is what this lowly official said reasonable? A beautiful smile bloomed on Yili's lips. Sun Xingji, who was so proud of himself, didn't notice the frown on his face. The people around Yili silently took 2 steps back to avoid being caught in the crossfire. Lord Sun, do you know that this consort just set fire to Xinyang? Yili's voice was clear and cold. Sun Xingji couldn't help but shiver. His smile was still stiff on his face as he stared blankly at the woman whose expression had suddenly changed. Wang! Princess consort, this consort dares to burn down Xinyang. I'm not afraid of killing 2 more useless officials. As soon as these words were spoken, the hearts of everyone present shook. They abruptly raised their heads to look at the green-clothed woman with an elegant appearance but a frosty expression. They were intimidated by the murderous aura that seemed to have materialized. They could not help but feel a chill in their hearts. The slight disdain that originally existed disappeared in an instant. Sun Xingji's face paled and then quickly turned red. They truly hadn't received the news from Xinyang. Even Yili, who had come to the city gates to greet them, had just received the news and hurriedly arranged for them to come. Hearing that Yili had set fire to Xinyang, although he was shocked, he did not want to lose face in front of the various officials and merchants of Hangzhou City. After all, he was an important official appointed by the imperial court to oversee the Northwest. In the Northwest, he was the highest-ranking official. His expression changing slightly, Sun Xingji said, Princess Ding. Xinyang is the largest city in the Northwest. You didn't even discuss with this official before setting fire to the city. Do you have any respect for the imperial court or the emperor? Yili smiled faintly and said, discuss. This consort wanted to find someone to discuss it with. But, where was Lord Sun at that time? This. Sun Xingji was slightly flustered. He quickly looked around and said confidently, this official is the governor of the Northwest. Naturally, I can't always be in charge of Xinyang. Yili smiled coldly and said, but this consort heard that Lord Sun left on the first day Xinyang fell. Does Lord Sun know how many people were killed when Xinyang fell? This. Without waiting for him to speak, Yili said, less than 1 in 10 of Xinyang's citizens survived. The number of casualties is more than 100,000. Since Lord Sun is an official of the Northwest, you should share the joys and sorrows of the Northwest people. If they're dead, why are you still alive? These words caused Sun Xingji's face to turn green and white. He finally sensed the cold murderous intent coming from the Mahist army that followed Yili. His heart trembled and he didn't dare to say anything more. Qi Anrong quickly came forward and said, Your Highness, please calm down. Your Highness, please enter the city and rest for a while. Yili glanced at him faintly and successfully shut him up. Then, she lifted her foot and walked into the city. Zhuajing, who was following behind Yili, stopped in front of Qi Anrong and said with a cold face, Everyone, go do what you need to do. Wang Fei probably won't have time to attend the welcoming banquet. Then, he didn't care about Qi Anrong's expression and turned to follow Yi Li into the city. Qi Anrong paused and looked helplessly at Sun Xingji. Lord Sun, this. Sun Xingji huffed lightly and said, the northwest still belongs to the emperor. With a flick of his sleeve, he followed into the city. After entering the city, the scene in Hangzhou City made the Mahist army generals angry. The entire city wasn't filled with song and dance, but just by looking at the city defense and the soldiers guarding the city, no one could tell that this was an army and city that was about to be invaded by a powerful enemy. The city defense was sparse, and the soldiers and generals were not alert at all. The generals following behind Yi Li all had ugly expressions. It was a blessing from the heavens that Hangzhou hadn't been taken over by the West Hill people. Before they could enter the governor's manor, Yi Li said coldly, bring the governor of Hangzhou to me. As you command. Entering the governor's manor, groups of servant girls and servants immediately came to greet them. The first few well-dressed noblewomen led a few young girls who were also adorned in jewelry to greet them. This concubine respectfully welcomes Wang Fei. Yi Li casually swept a glance. Just by looking at the quality of the clothing of the noblewoman at the front, she knew that these were the womenfolk of Sun Xingji and Qi Anrong. Sun Xingji's governor's manor had originally been in Xinyang. Ever since he fled to Hangzhou with his wife and children, he had been temporarily living in the governor's manor. Somewhat irritated, Yi Li glanced at the bejeweled womenfolk in front of her. She waved her hand and said, take them away. After speaking, she directly walked past the dazed womenfolk and headed for the main hall. The Mahist army's speed was naturally unquestionable. By the time Yi Li's group reached the main hall of the governor's manor, the general of Xinyang City had already been brought to the gate. Yi Li glanced at him and discovered that he wasn't among the people who had come to greet them at the city gates. Stepping into the main hall, Yi Li walked to the table and sat down. Sun Xingji and Qi Anrong also walked in one after the other. Seeing Yi Li seated high up in the main hall, Sun Xingji's expression changed slightly. Wang Fei, the visitor is a guest. How can a guest bully the host? Yi Li's brows were tightly knitted. She was somewhat annoyed by this fearless Sun Xingji. Did he think that just because he was one of Mo Jingqi's people, she wouldn't dare to do anything to him? Chapter 353. Sun official, if there's nothing else, then go to the side. Ben Fei will talk with Sun official after this matter is taken care of. Sun Xingji said discontentedly, Wang Fei is a woman and should stay in the inner compound to manage the Ding Wang Fu for the prince. What right do you have to sit in the court and have people capture General Wang? What right do I have? Yi Li smiled coldly and said, because Ben Fei is the highest commander of the Mahist army in the northwest. Sun Xingji's eyes widened and he said in disbelief, are you joking? How can the commander of the Mahist army be a woman? Even if you are the Ding Wang Fei, you don't have the right to order people around in Hangzhou. Yi Li was too lazy to pay attention to this person. She gave a look to Qin Feng. Qin Feng understood and waved his hand. Two guards came forward, one on the left and one on the right, and pressed Sun Xingji into a chair on the side. Sun Xingji was a scholar. No matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't overcome the two young and strong guards. He was suppressed to the point he couldn't move. Glaring angrily at Yi Li took a sip of tea. She smiled faintly and said, if Sun official insists on disturbing Ben Fei, then don't blame Ben Fei for being rude to an important official of the court. Sun Xingji gritted his teeth and said, this official will definitely report to the emperor about the Ding Wang Fu. As you wish. In this kind of situation, what difference did it make whether he reported or not? Yi Li's gaze turned to the other general who was also being held. General Wang. Hangzhou's guardian General Wang Duo. What is your relationship with Wang Xiaorong of the palace? Wang Duo struggled a few times to no avail. He raised his head and glared at Yi Li, saying, Wang Xiaorong is Ben General's younger cousin. What does Wang Fei mean? Release Ben General. Don't forget Ben General is the Guardian General of Hangzhou. Yili flipped through the files on the table and threw them down. They landed right in front of Wang Duo and said, "From now on, you are no longer the Guardian General of Hangzhou. Take a look for yourself." Wang Duo did not pick up the file on the ground. Instead, he angrily said, "What does Wang Fei mean?" This general's position was personally conferred by the emperor and the imperial court. Does Wang Fei think that it can be revoked with just one word from Wang Fei? Yili smiled and took out a jade pendant. She waved it in her hand and said with a smile, "Then does this have the right to remove you?" Emperor Taizu's last wish was that in times of crisis during a war, the one who held the Yanzi jade pendant in the king's mansion could control all generals below the rank of great general in Dechu state. Or is General Wang not a general of the Dechu state? This. Of course, Wang Duo knew about the decree that Taizu had left behind. Although the generals loyal to the emperor now might not really buy it, before the emperor decreed that Taizu's decree was abolished, they could at most obey in public but oppose in private. They absolutely could not oppose it face to face. Yili took back the jade pendant and said to Feng Xiao, "Feng San, Hangzhou's defense will be handed over to you." Feng Xiao smiled wholeheartedly and looked at the somewhat absent-minded Wang Duo. He nodded and said, "This general obeys. This general will immediately adjust Hangzhou's defense." Finished speaking, he waved his hand and led several generals out of the door. After Feng Xiao and the others left, Yili looked at Wang Duo and the others again. She smiled sweetly, "All right, now General Wang and Sun Daren can say whatever you want." Wang Duo unwillingly said, "The troops of Hangzhou will not listen to a general who does not even have an official rank in the imperial court." He was talking about Feng Xiao. Although Feng Xiao was publicly recognized as Mo Xiaoyao's right-hand man in the Mahist army, Feng Xiao was the only general in the Mahist army who did not have an official rank. Yili smiled slightly and said, "Whether or not he can make people listen to him is Feng San's problem. There is no need for General Wang to worry." Wang Duo gave a light snort and had nothing to say. Yili looked sideways at Sun Xingji who was sitting to the side and smiled. "Sun Daren has something to say?" Sun Xingji sneered, "With Wang Fei's prestige, how would this official dare to speak?" Yili pursed her lips and smiled, "Since you don't dare to speak, then there is no need to speak. Sun Daren can live peacefully in Hangzhou. When the war is over, this Fei will send someone to send Sun Daren back to the capital. If unfortunately Hangzhou is lost, this Fei will give Sun Daren a chance to live and die with Hangzhou." Hearing this, Sun Xingji's face twisted. He gritted his teeth and said, "Many thanks, Wang Fei." After sending off Sun Xingji and Wang Duo, Qi Anrong was the only one left in the hall. He looked at the woman on the seat with fear and trepidation. With a flattering smile, he said, "Wang Fei." Yili looked at him and said with a smile that was not a smile, "Qi Daren, your position as the governor of Hangzhou is very comfortable. Not to mention this Fei, even the prince would be very envious." "I don't dare. I don't dare." Qi Anrong smiled apologetically. Yili flipped through the file in her hand and said, 6 years in office, a family fortune of 1 million. 1 wife, 12 concubines, 4 sons, 6 daughters. No wonder this Fei heard that in 3 years, Magistrate Qing earned 100,000 snowflake silver. Qi Daren must have earned more than 100,000 this year, right? Wang Fei, this lowly official, this lowly official. Qi Anrong kept wiping the sweat on his forehead. Yili casually threw the file to the side and said, "Qi Daren, don't be nervous. This Fei is not interested in Qi Daren's wealth, concubines, and children." Hearing this, Qi Anrong's eyes brightened. He looked at Yili expectantly. Yili looked down and said lightly, "The war with the West Hill is imminent, Hangzhou City." Qi Anrong was very smart and quickly said, "It is this lowly official's duty to cooperate with Wang Fei to fight against the West Hill bandits. Wang Fei, please give me your orders." Yili looked up and said with a smile, "This won't make things difficult for Qi Daren?" Qi Anrong smiled and said, "How can it be? As long as Hangzhou is safe, It is good for everyone, isn't it? Wang Fei, please give me your orders. Yi Li nodded with satisfaction. Very good. Since Qi Darren has made things convenient for me, this Fei will not make things difficult for Qi Darren. As long as Qi Darren manages Hangzhou City well, this Fei will take care of everything else. This lowly official understands. This lowly official will not disappoint Wang Fei. Very good. Qi Darren, please go back first. After sending Qi Anrong off, Yi Li looked disdainfully at the disappearing figure and said, Wang Fei, are we really going to let Qi Anrong off so easily? Yi Li smiled coldly, let him off. That will depend on whether he is tactful. We have just arrived in Hangzhou. We can't offend everyone at once, can we? This lowly official understands. The entire northwest, especially within Hangzhou, was filled with battles of various sizes almost every day. This time, Yi Li was not personally leading the troops into battle. Instead, she was sitting in Hangzhou City and giving orders from afar. Because she was no longer alone. In her womb lived a small, almost undetectable baby. This was her and Imo Xiaoyao's first child. Even though she had never been a mother, she knew that as a mother, she had to protect her child. Dr. Yang, how is it? After taking the pulse, Yi Li pulled back her wrist and asked the young doctor in front of her. Dr. Yang respectfully said, it's nothing serious. However, this lowly official will say the same thing. Wang Fei, please do not overexert yourself. Otherwise, even if there is no danger, it will not be good for the little Shitzi in your womb. Yi Li nodded and said, I will remember doctor's words. Thank you for your trouble. In that case, this lowly official will go and adjust Wang Fei's meals. Dr. Yang bowed his head and left. Chapter 354. After the doctor left, Zhuojing and the others finally raised their heads to look worriedly at Yi Li. Zhuojing frowned and said, Wang Fei, for the sake of little Shitzi, Wang Fei should rest more. The others nodded. Yi Li grimaced and said helplessly, how can I be negligent now? But you will have to work harder. The sooner you can take charge, the more free I will be. Zhuojing lowered his head in shame. This subordinate is useless. Yi Li waved her hand and said with a smile, it's not that you are useless. It is difficult for anyone to take charge in just 2 or 3 months. You have already done very well. Zhuojing was speechless and glanced at Yi Li. The few of them had followed Princess Consort since the beginning. It seemed that nothing could trouble Princess Consort since the beginning. Compared to Wang Fei, how could they, as grown men, not be incompetent? Many times, he couldn't help but wonder if Wang Fei was a genius or if the Su family really taught her well. Wang Fei, there is a Mr. Han outside the Fu asking for an audience. The guard outside the door came in to report. Mr. Han. Yi Li stilled and quickly reacted, Han Mingxi. Quick, invite him in. A short while later, Han Mingxi stepped into the study. He was still wearing a grand dark red robe. After not seeing him for a few months, his originally seductive features had changed slightly. He now had a hint of the sharpness and decisiveness of a person in a high position. But when he saw Yi Li, he still had a trace of a wicked smile. His voice was deep and lingering. Jun Wei. I haven't seen you for a long time. I miss you. Yi Li looked at the handsome man in front of her and sighed softly, Mingxi, why have you come? Han Mingxi walked into the study and smiled helplessly. I heard that Jun Wei led an army as Ding Country Wang Fei and defeated Genom of Gojoseon of Xiling. Isn't that awe-inspiring? No matter what, I should come and see the elegance of the Ding Wang Fei, right? Her slightly raised peach blossom eyes stared at Yi Li, not concealing the bit of anger in her eyes. Knowing that he was concerned about her, Yi Li smiled and said, what awe-inspiring. I had no choice. And, it wasn't me who beat up Genom of Gojoseon of West Hill. The situation in the Northwest is not easy recently. If you had come a little later, I might have been the one who was beaten up. Han Mingxi snorted softly and glanced at Zhuo Jing and the others who appeared to be busy but were actually eavesdropping. He said, "Where is your Prince Ding? Isn't he known as the god of war? What kind of man is he to throw his wife into the battlefield and charge into the enemy lines?" Mingxi. Yi Li looked at him with a smile. "I know you care about me as a friend, but in this situation, no matter how powerful Xiaoyao is, he can't split himself." Han Mingxi sneered and turned his head to ignore her. But when he heard Yi Li defend Mo Xiaoyao, his clear and handsome eyes darkened slightly. Yi Li saw Han Mingxi's dejection, but since some things were destined, they shouldn't be tangled up. If one was indecisive, it would hurt others and oneself in the end. She stood up and said with a smile, "You came at the right time. Hangzhou is not bad now. Why don't you rest for a while and we can talk about it tomorrow? Oh right, Master Mingyue is also in the Fu right now. You should go and see him." When she mentioned Han Mingyue, Han Mingxi was startled again and his expression was complicated. Every time he thought of his older brother who had raised him since he was young, Han Mingxi felt angry and helpless. The kindness of raising him and teaching him was not something that could be resolved with a word of severing ties. Han Mingxi respected his older brother even more than his parents who had passed away early. The reason why he was so against Han Mingyue taking action against Yi Li was because of his friendship with Yi Li, but it was more because he understood that it was not worth it for his older brother to betray his brother and go against the Ding Palace for such a woman. It was a dead end. And now, the same reason why Han Mingxi came all the way to Hangzhou, other than because Yi Li was here, it was also because he had received the news that Han Mingyue had been captured. Hearing Yi Li's words, he knew that Han Mingyue was not doing badly. At the same time, he also understood that Yi Li could let Han Mingyue go so easily because of him. He couldn't help but feel warm in his heart. "Junwei, thank you." Yi Li smiled faintly. "What are you thanking for?" Han Mingyue had made a deal with Xiaoyao. Since Xiaoyao spared his life, there is no difference between letting him live a better or worse life. You brothers have not seen each other for a long time. Go and take a look. Han Mingxi nodded and turned to leave the study. In the small courtyard, Han Mingyue sat leisurely in the corridor, looking at the withered chrysanthemum with only a few petals left. But his expression was not as relaxed as his sitting posture. His handsome brows were slightly wrinkled and from time to time, he would look at a closed window not far away. His handsome face was filled with worry. "Big brother." Han Mingxi's voice came from the corner. Han Mingyue was startled for a moment. He turned back to look at his younger brother whom he had not seen for a long time and couldn't help but smile bitterly. "Mingxi's qinggong is getting better and better. I didn't even notice it." Han Mingyue looked at him for a while before slowly saying, "Big brother, I did not use qinggong. You were the one who did not hear my footsteps." Following his gaze, although they had just entered Hangzhou City, Han Mingxi had already figured out the whole story of how Han Mingyue had been captured by Yi Li and naturally, he also knew what kind of person could make his elder brother so worried. He frowned in disgust and said, "Big brother is still stubborn." Han Mingyue looked at him quietly. After a long time, he chuckled and said, "If you can understand, then how can it be called stubborn? Mingxi, after not seeing you for a while, you have grown up." Han Mingxi's face stiffened and he uncomfortably turned his head away. His heart was filled with mixed feelings. Since he was young, he had been mischievous and willful. He always saw his elder brother helplessly shake his head at him. Now that he suddenly heard his elder brother's praise, he was somewhat unable to regain his senses, but also very happy. But when he thought of the price he had to pay for growing up, these days, Han Mingxi's life was not as comfortable as others imagined. When he first took over the Han family, it was when the world knew that Han Mingyue had defected to West Hill. Even with the protection of the Ding King's mansion, he still spent a lot of energy and thought to stabilize the Han family's foundation. Moreover, the Ding King's mansion had many capable people. How could they easily submit to a yellow-haired boy who had just submitted to the Prince Ding mansion? These days could be said to be the most fulfilling days that Han Mingxi had lived in the past 20 years. Han Mingyue naturally did not know that Han Mingxi had suffered. Although she felt guilty, she was also gratified that her younger brother was able to pull through. Furthermore, he was able to shoulder the burden of the entire Han family and was not implicated by her. She reached out and patted Han Mingxi's shoulder, softly saying, "It's been hard on you. Are you still blaming your elder brother?" Han Mingxi's eyes were hot, but he stubbornly turned his face away. When his emotions had calmed down, he turned his head to gaze at Han Mingyue and asked, "Junwei has already told me about your deal with Prince Ding. What does elder brother plan to do in the future?" Han Mingyue smiled faintly and said, "I'm afraid that there is no place for us in the Dechu State and West Hill. When all of this is over, I will take Zui Dai to live in seclusion in Nanzhao." Han Mingyue looked at him steadily and asked, "You are so sure that Zui Dai will go with you?" "Elder brother, to be honest, in terms of choosing women, you and Prince Ding are not just a little bit different." Chapter 355. Han Mingyue said with a smile, "If I had the same taste as Prince Ding, my life would be even more difficult now. So, Mingxi, if you can, stay away from Princess Ding. Men can be unreasonable when they get jealous." Han Mingxi was a little embarrassed when his big brother saw through his thoughts. Thinking about it again, he felt that his big brother's words made some sense. His big brother had taken a fancy to Su Zuidi. If he really wanted her, there might be a way to get her. But a woman like Yili. Glaring hatefully at Han Mingyue, who changed the topic, he said, "I know what I'm doing, but I'll give you a piece of advice. You and I both know what kind of woman Su Zuidi is. If you really want her to follow you obediently, why don't you try my method?" Han Mingyue looked at him curiously with raised eyebrows. Han Mingxi sneered and said with a malicious smile, "If you destroy her face, she will naturally follow you obediently. But big brother, do you really love Su Zuidi or do you only love her face?" Han Mingyue was silent. Did he love Su Zuidi as a person or her face? He himself might not be able to say it clearly. The person he loved. After so many years, he still didn't know that personality and that heart were not what he liked at all. Love that face? Su Zuidi was indeed very beautiful. But the world was so big that it was not impossible to find one or two women who could be compared to her. He only knew that year, when he saw that stunning woman among the falling petals for the first time in the peach blossom forest, he sank into a deep dream and never woke up. Looking at Han Mingyue, who was still in a daze, Han Mingxi secretly sighed. How did his elder brother, whom he had once been so proud of, fall into the hands of a woman like Su Zuidi who only had looks? Thinking of his elder brother's resolute departure in Guangling back then, thinking of how dejected he was when Su Zuidi abandoned his elder brother back then, thinking of how he was now trapped with nothing, Han Mingxi's slightly narrowed eyes overflowed with a bit of murderous intent. Han Mingyue frowned slightly and looked at Han Mingxi. "Mingxi, don't hurt her. Big brother is begging you." Han Mingxi looked at his elder brother's pleading face and felt a wave of sadness in his heart. Mr. Mingyu was like the bright moon and unparalleled romantic. But now, he was begging him, the disreputable hedonistic son of Mr. Fengyu, for the sake of a woman. At this moment, Han Mingxi finally understood something that was already set in stone. The world would never see that cultured and elegant young Master Mingyu again. "Big brother, do you really not regret it?" Han Mingxi asked. Han Mingyue smiled faintly and remained silent. Now, it was too late for regrets. After a long time, Han Mingxi finally gave up. Nodding, he turned around and said, "All right, I understand. Big brother, take care of yourself. If one day you are killed by that woman, I will kill her and bury her with you." Han Mingyue silently watched her brother turn and leave. In the end, she didn't say anything more. Although he had left behind a terrible mess, Mingxi had ultimately relied on herself to survive. As for him, he turned around and looked at the woman in white who was walking towards him. A faint, bitter smile tugged at the corners of his lips. Han Mingyue. Su Zuidi walked lightly to the corridor and looked at Han Mingyue, who was leaning against a pillar. Her expression was gloomy and her exquisite face was filled with displeasure. When exactly can we leave this damned place? Su Zuidi felt like she was going crazy. She had never regretted agreeing to Genom of Gojoseon to return to the Chu state to seduce Mo Xiaoyao so much. It was fine that she didn't succeed in seducing Mo Xiaoyao. These days, she had been moving around with the army. She had been eating plain tea and wearing the most ordinary clothes. The worst thing was that she couldn't stop to rest whenever she wanted to. Every day was exhausting. After finally arriving in Hangzhou, she originally thought that she could live a more comfortable life. However, Yili had people shove her into this small, simple courtyard and no longer cared about her. Other than the people who brought her food every day, there weren't even any maids to serve her. This made Su Zuidi's patience reach its limit. In fact, what Su Zuidi didn't know was that the reason why there weren't any maids or servants in this courtyard wasn't because Yili deliberately mistreated her. It was because Han Mingyue had dismissed all the people she sent. Therefore, Su Zuidi had to wash herself every day, tidy up her own room and even wash her own clothes. Seeing Su Zuidi's impatience and anger, Han Mingyue felt as if her heart was being stabbed by a blunt knife. She frowned and recalled Han Mingxi's words. She faintly lowered her eyes and asked, "Leave here? Where do you want to go?" "Back to Xiling, of course." Not noticing Han Mingyue's expression, Su Zuidi answered matter-of-factly, "I want to return to the palace. I can't stand this damned place anymore." Han Mingyue looked up at her with a calm expression. "You don't want to take revenge on Princess Ding?" Su Zuidi was startled and frowned with some hesitation. Of course she wanted to take revenge on Yili. She wanted to even in her dreams. But she wasn't a fool. As long as Mo Xiaoyao was still alive, she wouldn't dare to take revenge on Yili. She grew up with Mo Xiaoyao. She could look down on any man in this world, but she definitely wouldn't dare to look down on Mo Xiaoyao. Looking at Han Mingyue, Su Zuidi gently bit the corner of her lips and asked, "You said you would help me. Is that true?" Han Mingyue looked at her and didn't say anything. Su Zuidi took his reaction as a tacit agreement. Her eyes wandered and her slender hand pressed against Han Mingyue's chest. Her voice was gentle and moving. "Mingyue, can you help me, kill Xiaoyao?" Han Mingyue's heart turned cold. He lowered his head and looked at the woman leaning against his chest. She had a face that was as otherworldly as a fairy from the ninth heaven, but the words that came out of her cherry mouth made people shudder. "I thought you couldn't forget Xiaoyao." Su Zuidi didn't care at all and said with a faint smile, "Of course I can't forget Xiaoyao. Even if he dies, I won't forget him in this life." "Mingyue, do you still remember Xiaoyao's appearance in the Chu capital? At that time, I knew that there wouldn't be a man more outstanding than him in this world. Unfortunately, at that time, he was only the second young master of the Ding Palace, Prince Ding's younger brother. If there wasn't Mo Xiaowin, then it would be even more perfect. Unfortunately, even though he's already Prince Ding now, I can no longer see the elegant appearance that was famous in the Chu capital." Hearing Su Zuidi's words that seemed to be talking to herself, Han Mingyue's heart suddenly jumped. He stood blankly in the corridor and didn't have the slightest reaction to the warm and fragrant jade in his arms, as if he had sunk into some kind of thought. Su Zuidi also didn't really want Han Mingyue to express her opinion. She only continued with a smile, "Originally, I thought that perhaps one day, Xiaoyao and I could still be together. But after this reunion, I finally understood. Xiaoyao has already been seduced by that slut Yili. You've also seen how ruthless he is to me. Since I can't have him, then that slut Yili can also forget about having him." Speaking to here, Su Zuidi's beautiful face had already become distorted because of the resentment on her face. She raised her head and looked at Han Mingyue with eyes full of tenderness and affection. "Mingyue, help me kill Mo Xiaoyao. Help me kill Mo Xiaoyao and I'll be yours." Han Mingyue's eyes were empty and blank. "Kill Mo Xiaoyao." Chapter 356. Su Zuidi nodded and said softly, "You know, I only like the strongest man in the world. Kill Mo Xiaoyao, to prove that you are the strongest man in the world." Han Mingyue was silent for a long time, then suddenly asked, "Do you want to come with me? You want to see Mo Xiaoyao die with your own eyes?" Su Zuidi's eyes flashed and she smiled sweetly. "I'll wait for you in the Emperor of Xiling City. Bring Mo Xiaoyao's head to me. Then we can be together forever." Han Mingyue stared at her until Su Zuidi couldn't maintain the smile on her lips. Then he slowly pulled her hand away and turned to walk into the depths of the courtyard. Su Zuidi was startled and looked at Han Mingyue's back in confusion. She was too used to Han Mingyue's demands. In fact, Han Mingyue had never really refused her. Even when she left him for the Western Tomb, no matter how cold Han Mingyue was to her, as long as she asked, Han Mingyue would definitely do it for her. But this time, she suddenly felt a little uncertain. "Mingyue," Han Mingyue turned back, his handsome face full of exhaustion. "Zuidi, have you thought about what would happen if I went to kill Xiaoyao?" He was no longer the Han Mingyue who controlled the Tianyi Pavilion. Even when he was at the peak of his power, he didn't have the confidence to say that he could kill Han Mingyue. Su Zuidi frowned slightly, then smiled and said, "I know this is very dangerous. Mingyue, I will naturally find someone to help you." Han Mingyue was unmoved. "Do you know what will happen to the Dechu state if Mo Xiaoyao dies?" Su Zuidi frowned unhappily. "What does the Dechu state have to do with us? Mingyue, are you going to help me or not?" Han Mingyue shook his head heavily. Seeing Su Zuidi's expression suddenly change, he glared at her and cursed her for being useless, then turned and left. Seeing her leave without hesitation, Han Mingyue sighed. If he agreed, not to mention assassinating Mo Xiaoyao, whether they could survive the night would be a problem. This was the woman he loved? The white figure was no longer in the corridor, Han Mingyue thought bitterly. In the study of the governor's office, almost all the generals of the Mahist army in the northwest, except for those who were leading the troops outside, had come. Yi Li sat in a comfortable chair, smiling as she listened to the general report on the situation of the war in the past few days. Although most of the generals who stayed in the northwest were relatively young and almost none of them were famous, the southern Marquis, who was considered dead by outsiders, stayed. Marquis Nan's experience were not comparable to the average young general. Although he could not go to the battlefield openly, he had taught Yi Li a lot of knowledge about marching and fighting. At the same time, he had taken a lot of pressure off her. 3 of the 11 cities in the northwest are in the hands of the West Hill. 2 of them are being fought over repeatedly. The other 6 cities are completely in the hands of our army. "Princess, please give us your orders." Yi Li nodded with satisfaction. "You have all worked hard to peacefully control the cities that were originally in the hands of the imperial court's garrison to the Mahist army. The effort spent was definitely not less than fighting against the West Hill people. In this way, the situation in the northwest was finally in the hands of the Mahist army. Even if the West Hills sent more troops to the northwest, they had enough room to deal with it. They did not have to worry about being attacked from the front and back and being schemed against by Mo Jingqi's people. Everyone stood up and said they did not dare. Yi Li smiled and looked at Marquis Nan, who was drinking tea. She asked, "Marquis, what do you think about the upcoming war?" Marquis Nan bowed to Yi Li and said, "The northwest is about to enter winter. If the West Hill people do not want to waste time with us until next spring, I am afraid that they will intensify their attacks. I think that we do not need to be polite to them. We must fight back fiercely. The northwest is one of the 3 granaries of the Dechu state. If we continue to fight after spring, I am afraid that it will affect the people's farming." Marquis Nan was modest. He called himself a subordinate to a young woman like Yi Li. This already showed his current attitude. On the other hand, Marquis Nan was very satisfied with Yi Li's performance. This Princess Ding was not like other women who were arrogant or greedy for power. She was even more like someone who pretended to know what she did not know. She was very clear that she was not good at mobilizing troops on a large scale, so she was never stingy with asking for the opinions of her subordinates. A true commander did not need to be able to charge and break through enemy lines. He did not even need to be able to arrange troops. He only needed to be able to make good use of capable people and be able to make the right choice at the crucial moment. No wonder Du Qua praised Princess Ding so much. In Marquis Nan's view, although Princess Ding was a woman, she already had the air of a ruler. Yili nodded and said, Marquis Nan is very thoughtful. I am also very worried about this matter. Since that is the case, everyone should speak their own thoughts. In reality, Yili was not only worried about the problem of next year's spring plowing in the northwest. Although the Mahist army and the imperial court had not officially fallen out, everyone knew that regardless of the final result of this battle, the balance between the Ding Palace and the Dechu state's imperial family that had been maintained for more than 100 years would no longer exist. If the Mahist army was defeated, then there would naturally be no Ding Palace in the world. If they won, then Mo Jingqi would probably take advantage of the Mahist army's exhaustion from the battle to cause a great disaster. Therefore, Yili was very clear in her heart that the Northwest was not as simple as driving out the Wiling people. She also had to protect the entire Northwest for Mo Xiaoyao and ensure that this land was in the hands of the Mahist army. This was because it was very likely to become the Mahist army's last retreat. Therefore, they needed to pay more attention to food. These days, the Mahist army had been fighting and stopping. It was almost as if they were just delaying the footsteps of the Xiling army. There were almost no truly spectacular battles. Therefore, the soldiers were fighting very sullenly. They had long been ready to give the West Hill people a head-on blow. At this time, when they heard Yili's words, they suddenly became excited and began to talk about their own opinions. Suddenly, the whole study became noisy. Han Mingxi sat in the corner and quietly looked at the woman who was sitting leisurely in front of him and seriously listening to the general's opinions. He naturally could not get a word in such a purely military meeting. He only sat quietly and looked at Yili's elegant face with an indifferent and calm smile. From time to time, she would express her own views and opinions to everyone's opinions. For some reason, Han Mingxi's thoughts gradually drifted back to when he had first met Yili a long time ago. At that time, the elegant youth dressed in men's clothing overlapped with the woman who calmly controlled hundreds of thousands of troops in front of him. Han Mingxi suddenly felt an indescribable bitterness in his heart. If at that time, the thought in his heart had only appeared. Han Mingxi smiled bitterly and shook his head to get rid of the absurd thought in his heart. Even if they had known each other earlier, Jun Wei would not have chosen him, clear? Han Mingxi came back to his senses. He blinked and found that the noisy study had quieted down. The generals who had finished the meeting had all left. Only Zhuo Jing and Wei Lin were still sorting out the files in the side hall not far away. Yili looked at him with a smile and said, "What are you thinking about? It's rare to see you in a trance." Han Mingxi smiled and looked at her up and down. He said, "The war is coming. You are different now. Will there be any problem?" Yili was stunned. She unconsciously stroked her flat belly and smiled. "Feng San told you?" Han Mingxi nodded and asked, "Can't I know?" Chapter 357. Yili shook her head. "It's not a secret. It's just that it wouldn't be good if news of the battle between the two armies were to spread. You don't have to worry, I'm in good health. Moreover, I don't need to personally charge into battle." Han Mingxi glanced at her and said, "If you still want to charge into battle, you'll scare Feng San to death." Mo Xiaoyao had not only left Feng Xiao behind to assist Yili in battle, but more importantly, Feng Xiao could be said to be Mo Xiaoyao's most trusted subordinate. The main reason for leaving him behind was to comfort Yili. Yili smiled and sighed softly, "I hope this battle can end soon." Han Mingxi said, "I can't help you much. If there's anything you need me to do, just say the word." Yili looked at him and smiled, "I really do have something I need your help with." After saying this, she took out a file from the bookshelf behind her and handed it to Han Mingxi. "You and Ling Haoyu aren't here. Originally, I could only delay this plan. But now that you're here, you can take a look." Han Mingxi took the sealed file and flipped through it. He raised his head and said in a deep voice, "Is it worth it for you to do so much for Mo Xiaoyao?" Yili smiled faintly, "I'm the emperor's consort, so I'm bound to him for good or ill. How can it be considered as doing it for him?" Han Mingxi's expression changed. After a while, he sighed and said, I understand. I will take care of this matter. This is also good for the Han family, isn't it? Yi Li smiled faintly, it's been hard on you. I thought we were friends. Yi Li smiled, yes, of course we are friends. At the beginning of October, Genom king of Gojoseon personally led 200,000 soldiers to attack Hongzhou. The Mahist army also fought with all their strength. It had been nearly 3 months since the start of the war in the northwest. This time, it was a real fight to the death. It also made the West Hill soldiers understand that the soldiers of the Dechu state were not as weak and useless as they had imagined. The Mahist army that had protected the Dechu state for hundreds of years was still a bloodthirsty sword. Originally, the difference in manpower between the two armies was not too big. However, unlike the Shilin army, which focused on attacking one place, the Mahist army had to defend the entire northwest. Therefore, the Shilin army still had the advantage in terms of numbers. Although the Shilin army was moving slowly, they still continued to move forward and gradually approached Hongzhou city. The originally peaceful Hongzhou city seemed to have become restless due to the impending storm. Many wealthy merchants and commoners brought their families and left Hongzhou city. The city was no longer as lively and peaceful as it used to be. Instead, it was a solemn and gloomy atmosphere before a great war. On the city tower, Yi Li leaned against the city wall and sat quietly. The warm early winter sun shone on her light green cloak. It was so comfortable that it made one feel drowsy. Yi Li had a set of chess pieces placed in front of her. She held a black piece in one hand and slowly pondered. The surrounding soldiers who were guarding the city gate tower looked from afar and felt a sense of tranquility and stability. Han Mingyue stepped onto the city tower and looked at the woman leaning against the city wall in deep thought. He was speechless for a long time. Yi Li raised her head and smiled at him. Master Mingyue, is something the matter? Han Mingyue silently walked to her and sat down. He stared at the chessboard for a long time before asking, what do you plan to do? Yi Li raised her eyes and asked in confusion, what plan? Han Mingyue frowned and said, the 200,000 soldiers of Genom of Gojoseon are approaching Hongzhou. Don't tell me you don't know. Seeing Han Mingyue lose his composure, Yi Li smiled and said, Master Mingyue, don't worry. Even if Hongzhou city is breached, I will send someone to escort you and Miss Su out of here before that happens. Han Mingyue stared at her and said in a low voice, you have already predicted that Hongzhou city will be breached? Yi Li shook her head and said, no, Hongzhou city will not be breached. Hongzhou city is the last pass in the northwest of Dechu state. Behind it is the flat land of the Central Plains, and the hundreds of thousands of Mahist army that is currently fighting. Even if the 200,000 Mahist army in the northwest all die in battle, Hongzhou will not fall into the hands of the West Hill. Once Hongzhou was breached, it meant that they had left the backs of the hundreds of thousands of Mahist army in the pass to the West Hill. The consequences would be unimaginable. Han Mingyue raised his eyebrows and looked at the quiet woman in front of him in confusion. Although he did not know much about the art of war, he was good at analyzing information and could understand some things. If you don't want Hongzhou to fall, why did you let the Shilin army continue to advance? Although the Mahist army has been wearing down the strength of the Shilin army, they have not really risked their lives. You don't have to hide it from me. Although the Tianyi Pavilion has not participated in the wars of other countries before, it does not mean that we have not studied it. The reason why the Mahist army was able to intimidate other countries was not only because of the prince who had ruled the country for generations, but also because of his excellent command of the army. The Mahist army's bravery and courage to advance without fear of death was more important. There were many historical records of the Mahist army's deeds. In order to defend an unimportant small city, they could all die in battle and would not retreat even half a step. In order to capture a pass, they could attack day and night. Even if there were piles of corpses under the city, they would not waver at all. The Mahist army today may be brave enough in the eyes of outsiders, but it was definitely not their true level. Yi Li casually threw down the chess piece in her hand and looked at the handsome man in front of her with a faint smile. Young Master Mingyu, are you worried about the Mahist army? Han Mingyue paused and said indifferently, Mingxi is my brother. I have to know if he can survive with the Prince Ding mansion. Clapping her hands, Yi Li stood up and said with a faint smile, young Master Mingyu, you don't have to worry about this. I know what to do. Han Mingyue said coldly, I don't see what you know. The Mahist army clearly has the ability to block the Xiling army outside of Hangzhou. No. Yi Li shook her head and looked at Han Mingyue seriously. The Mahist army does have the ability to temporarily block the Xiling army. But it is only temporary. Young Master Ming, you should know that the Xiling army invading the Dechu state this time is only about 500,000. But the Xiling army is more than 5 million. The Xiling people are brave and can recruit soldiers at any time. They don't need much training and can recruit at least 1 million people in a short time. At that time, even if the Mahist army can fight against 10 people, they won't be able to resist so many people. And the Xiling people are not weak. In these days of battles, 2 of our people can at most exchange for 3 of their people. Han Mingyue frowned and said, if that's the case, won't you be inviting a wolf into the house by letting them into Hangzhou? Yi Li's smile was faint and cold, like the frost on the branches in the winter morning. Genom of Gojoseon won't send reinforcements to the northwest for a while. Han Mingyue raised her eyebrows. Now the whole world knows that the commander of the Northwest Mahist army is me, a woman who is not even 18 years old. If Genom of Gojoseon still wants to send reinforcements from the Xiling, even if he wins, his reputation will be completely destroyed. A Xiling war god who had fought for decades, and a teenage girl who had never been on the battlefield. If Genom of Gojoseon still wanted to send reinforcements, it would be tantamount to admitting to the whole world that Lei Zhenting was not only inferior to Mo Lufang, but also to Mo Liufang's daughter-in-law. From then on, the name of Genom of Gojoseon would become a laughing stock. Chapter 358. You plan to. The smile on Yi Li's face gradually faded. She tilted her head to look at the wilderness in the distance and said indifferently, I want the 200,000 soldiers of Xiling to stay in the northwest. Han Mingyue's heart shook. He could clearly hear the unconcealed killing intent and bloodthirst in Yi Li's words. You want the 200,000 soldiers of Xiling to stay in the northwest? How can you dare to think like this? For the first time in his life, Han Mingyue clearly felt his voice tremble. Wanting to annihilate the entire 200,000 Xiling army, these words, how could a woman who had never been on the battlefield say it? No, perhaps it was because she had never been on the battlefield that she could say such arrogant words. Yi Li leaned against the city wall and looked at him with a smile. Why wouldn't I dare? These days, the Xiling army has been fighting for days. At most, no more than 100,000 have been able to reach Hangzhou City. This city will become the final place to bury them. Han Mingyue shuddered unconsciously, but a fiery feeling rose in her chest involuntarily. Looking steadily at Yi Li, Han Mingyue said, now I finally understand why Xiaoyao likes you. Yi Li raised her eyebrows and looked at him with a smile. Han Mingyue said with some nostalgia, I still remember that year. When Xiaoyao first went to the battlefield, he was only 13 or 14 years old. He said that as long as he was given 3 or 4 years, he might be able to sweep through Nanzhao and bring peace to the south of Dechu state for 100 years, it's a pity. Hearing his words, Yi Li seemed to be in a good mood. She said with a smile, that's why I am Princess Ding. Genom of Gojoseon. After hiding for so long, this consort is also looking forward to this battle. Late at night in a certain commander's tent in the Mahist army camp, the candles were still quietly burning. Mo Xiaoyao sat behind his desk and looked at the booklet in his hand. His brows furrowed from time to time. Mo Jingqi's determination to destroy the Mahist army was not to be underestimated. These days, the 500,000 Mahist army had to face more than 800,000 enemies on the surface. Including the enemies in the dark, a conservative estimate was around 1 million. Even though Mo Xiaoyao was a genius at war, this situation still put a lot of pressure on him. Not only did they have to divide their forces to deal with the armies from Nanzhao, Xiling, and the Li King, they also had to keep Mo Jingqi at bay. In less than a month, Mo Xiaoyao had actually lost a lot of weight compared to when he was sick. Prince Jin, who had not been seen for a long time, appeared at the door. His young face was still as silent as usual. Mo Xiaoyao raised his head and asked, "Has the battle report from the northwest come?" Jin nodded and handed the battle report he had just received to Mo Xiaoyao. No matter how late it was, the prince always insisted on reading the battle report from the northwest every day before he could rest. Jin, who knew this, was used to immediately sending the news to the prince every day for him to look over. Mo Xiaoyao reached out to take the report. He lowered his head to look and couldn't help but frown. The news that the Mahist army had retreated all the way to Hangzhou made him frown deeply. This did not seem like something the Mahist army was used to doing. Also, the Xiling army was not powerful enough to make the Mahist army retreat at such a speed. Looking at the casualty figures on the battle report, Mo Xiaoyao rubbed his forehead. "Is this Li Li's idea? What are you thinking about, Li Li?" After thinking for a moment, Mo Xiaoyao raised his head and said, "Bring me all the battle reports from the past few days, and the maps." Jin was a little surprised to see his lord suddenly stand up with a change in expression. He hurriedly responded and hurriedly turned to get the things that Mo Xiaoyao wanted. Jin moved quickly. Soon, the maps and battle reports that Mo Xiaoyao wanted were placed in front of him. Mo Xiaoyao carefully picked up each battle report and pondered over every word. He looked at the map from time to time and then fell into deep thought. "Prince?" Jin called out worriedly. The prince's complexion was not too good. Mo Xiaoyao lowered his eyes. His expression was bitter and helpless. "Li Li." Mo Xiaoyao looked at the map filled with markings in front of him and felt very conflicted. He understood Yi Li's plan and her intentions. But it was because of this that he felt exceptionally pained. His beloved wife, his Li Li, should have been the princess consort of Ding who was envied by everyone. But now, she could only lead thousands of soldiers and horses in a bloody storm in a desolate place like the Northwest. All of this was because of his incompetence. Cut off the Xiling army and the Xiling border guards, pity, wipe out 200,000 Xiling army. Li Li, Li Li. Mo Xiaoyao's heart suddenly seemed to be pulled by something. It was so painful that he could not breathe. Mo Xiaoyao's heart jumped when he finally calmed his churning thoughts. Li Li's plan may be good, but Xiling Genom of Gojoseon was not an ordinary person. If he saw through Li Li's plan. Suddenly standing up, Mo Xiaoyao said in a low voice, "Go prepare the horses. I need to go out. The generals will be in charge of the army for now." Jin stilled and looked in confusion at Mo Xiaoyao. It was already the middle of the night. Why would the prince suddenly want to go out? Looking at the files and maps spread out on the table, perhaps something had happened to the princess consort. Jin did not accept the order and said in a low voice, "Prince, it will be the 15th of the month soon. What if you're on the way? Furthermore, the war is urgent right now, so it's not appropriate for you to leave so suddenly." Mo Xiaoyao lowered his eyes and recalled that today was already the 13th of October. No matter what, it was impossible for him to reach Hong province within 2 days. And the important matters in the army needed to be dealt with. After thinking for a while, Mo Xiaoyao quickly came back to his senses and said, "Tomorrow morning, inform all the generals above the rank of general to come see I. Also, inform Mo Hua to immediately take people to the northwest to protect the princess consort. If necessary, take the princess consort away from the battlefield at all costs. Set out immediately." "Yes, Prince." Jin answered and left. Mo Xiaoyao weakly fell back into the chair and murmured in a low voice, "Li Li, you have to be safe. The war in the northwest seemed to have been suppressed for too long and finally exploded in an instant." After entering Hangzhou, Genom of Gojoseon quickly found that the Mahist army's attacks were getting fiercer and fiercer. The speed at which they wanted to advance was getting slower and slower. Looking at the distant Hangzhou, Genom of Gojoseon's gloomy face never saw a clear sky again. He knew that he had been tricked by Yi Li and lured to the northwest. But so what? Even if the Shilling army lost soldiers and generals, the Mahist army would not fare better than them. He did not believe that he would lose to a woman if they had the same number of soldiers. And time did not allow him to stop and wait for the reinforcements from the Shilling border to arrive. He had to take Hangzhou as quickly as possible and control the northwest to open a path for the incoming reinforcements. At the same time, he had to prepare to enter the Dechu state. Prince, most of the Mahist army has already retreated to Hangzhou. They should be prepared to defend Hangzhou to the death. Genom of Gojoseon raised his eyebrows and smiled. I thought that Yi Li had some great move. Defending Hangzhou to the death, can she defend for 10 days or half a month? By the time our army arrives, how many days will she be able to endure in Hangzhou city? His subordinate advised, Prince, do not lower your guard. Yi Li used only 20,000 soldiers to defend Everlasting Forest at Shattered Snow Pass. She really cannot be underestimated. Genom of Gojoseon put away his smile and said calmly, I naturally will not underestimate Yi Li. Take Hangzhou as quickly as possible. Of course he would not underestimate her. He would use all his strength to take Hangzhou. Underestimating the enemy was not a mistake that people his age would make. Thinking of that seemingly graceful and elegant woman, he was really curious. When he took Hangzhou and stood in front of her, would she still be able to maintain her composure? Chapter 359. On the 13th of the 10th month, the Shilling army finally arrived at the city gates, and Hangzhou city was met with an unprecedented fierce attack. But at the same time, the Shilling army also met with a stubborn resistance that they had never faced before. On top of the city walls, the Black Cloud cavalry shot arrows at the invaders like rain, but the people below the city walls also charged forward without any regard for their own safety. Genom of Gojoseon rode his horse behind the Shilling army. He could vaguely see a woman in green sitting at the highest point of the city walls, calmly looking down at the battle below. Behind the woman in green, a few tall men stood with their hands behind their backs, also watching this battle. From afar, Genom of Gojoseon could still recognize that the handsome man in red was Prince Ding's trusted aide, Feng Xiao. Seeing his opponent sitting so leisurely on the high platform, Genom of Gojoseon's eyes revealed a murderous aura. He was so angry that he laughed, what a great imperial concubine. On the high platform, Yi Li also looked at a place behind the Shilling army from afar. She turned around and smiled at Feng Xiao, Feng San. This is the first time we are fighting against Genom of Gojoseon face to face, right? Feng Xiao rolled his eyes in boredom, isn't it? Before, we were either playing tricks or retreating while fighting. If we continue to fight like this, people will start to suspect that our Mahist army only knows how to retreat. Hearing Feng Xiao's resentful complaints, Yi Li smiled and said, if that's the case, then we should celebrate. After saying this, Yi Li turned around and took the pipa from Qin Feng's hands. She lightly played it, and a clear melody flowed out from between her fingers. Yi Li smiled faintly, her 10 fingers nimbly dancing on the pipa. The sound of the pipa gradually grew louder and louder, gradually spreading throughout the entire battlefield. The soldiers who were fighting did not have the time to appreciate the majestic music. Even the slightest mistake on the battlefield could cost them their lives. However, that seemingly gloomy yet seemingly high-spirited voice clearly reached the ears of every soldier. The Mahist army's officers and soldiers seemed to recall the past glory of the Mahist army. It was as if they saw the heroic and domineering prince of the past leading them to charge and break through enemy lines. Expel the bandits and revive the spirit of our Mahist army. Not only did someone shout this, but the people on the battlefield immediately became murderous. Kill! Standing beside Yi Li, Feng Xiao's expression changed slightly as he said, this is the song of King Yu breaking the battle formation. Yi Li did not reply. Her 10 fingers flew swiftly as she played a string of majestic, murderous notes. Yi Li had been raised by the Su family and the Su family since she was a child. How could she not know music? She just didn't like it. This song of entering the battle formation was originally a Guqin song. It was majestic, simple and elegant with an ancient style. However, Yili felt that it was more suitable to be played by a pipa. Just like the ambush from her previous life, other instruments might be able to play it, but it would definitely be difficult to achieve the effect of a pipa. A pipa's fingering and range was very suitable for such an intense and majestic song. Feng Zhiao clearly did not expect Yili to reply. He only said softly, "The song of King Yu breaking the battle formation has been lost for more than 200 years. Probably only the Su family would have such an ancient score." When two armies fought, it was said that the courageous would win. When the Mahist army soldiers were murderous because of their Wangfei, the West Hill soldiers were weaker in comparison. In the distance, the Shilin army's banner flew out. Genom of Gojoseon stared dazedly at the figure in green in the distance, his eyes bright. The general beside him whispered, "Prince, the Mahist army is in full swing. Why don't we avoid them first?" It had to be said that the Wangfei of Dingguo was indeed a talent. Just a piece of pipa music could raise the momentum of the entire Mahist army to a new level. Genom of Gojoseon looked up to the sky and laughed. He pointed the horsewhip in his hand to the highest point on the city wall and laughed loudly. "This kind of woman is interesting. Compared to her, all the beauties in the world are trash. Haha, whoever dares to retreat will be killed. This woman. I must have her." The general beside him nodded and did not dare to persuade him again. Genom of Gojoseon smiled and said, "I heard that Imo Xiaoyao is a genius in arranging troops. But I don't know if there is anyone in the Mahist army who can break the array now that Imo Xiaoyao is not in the army." Genom of Gojoseon obviously also recognized that the song just now was the song of King Yu breaking the array. The West Hill and Eastern Chu came from the same source 1,000 years ago. Although many of their cultures were different, they were similar. With a wave of his hand, the war drums sounded behind him. Several soldiers waved the red flags in their hands. Soon, the West Hill soldiers' array began to change. Such changes could not be hidden from Yili and the others who were looking down from above. Feng Zhiao frowned and looked at the changes below. He said, "6-flower array." "No. What's the difference?" The West Hill soldiers below the city wall quickly formed a huge array that was circular on the inside and square on the outside. And this huge array was encased in countless small arrays. The Mahist army originally had fewer soldiers than the West Hill army. At this moment, they were as small as the ocean in the array. Feng Zhiao snorted and waved his hand. A green flag appeared above the city wall. The Mahist army's array also changed. A huge black dragon occupied the entire battlefield. The domineering and arrogant dragon head was the most elite black cloud cavalry of the Mahist army. Wherever it went, no one dared to go against its sharp edge. When the black dragon swung its tail, the enemy's array could only be in disarray and on the verge of collapse. Behind the Shilin army, a small black flag rose. The 6-flower array on the battlefield changed into a giant rock's sharp claws and quickly grabbed the black dragon's body. In an instant, the giant dragon was cut in two. "Damn it!" Feng Zhiao cursed in a low voice. The flag on the city wall changed again. The giant dragon of the Mahist army immediately turned into countless black arrows and rushed towards the giant rock. Yili stood up and looked at the battle below the city wall. The so-called arrays of modern warfare had long been lost and were not really needed. So Yili was very unfamiliar with them. Although she had seen a lot of them in military books, she knew nothing about them in practice. At this moment, when she saw Feng Zhiao commanding the army's array, she finally had some real ideas in her heart. At the same time, she lowered her head and thought of a way to break the array. Array formation was not a knowledge that could be mastered with just a little bit of knowledge. At the very least, it was very difficult for Yili, who was currently on the battlefield, to help Feng Zhiao in this regard. Even if she could understand and come up with some ideas, she would definitely not be able to let the Mahist army under the city wall understand her intentions. Moreover, Yili was only a beginner in array formation. No matter what, she would not be so arrogant as to think that she could immediately go up and compete with Genom of Gojosian, who was known as the war god of West Hill, to see who was better at array formations. Standing on a high place, Yi Li stared at the battlefield below without blinking. As expected, after a few changes in the array, the Mahist army's array gradually began to collapse and fall into the Shilling army's encirclement. Princess. Qin Feng frowned and wanted to say something anxiously. He came from the Black Cloud Cavalry, but he was not the highest commander of the Black Cloud Cavalry. Cavalry also did not know much about arrays and were not proficient in them. But this did not stop him from seeing the fact that the Mahist army was gradually losing. Yi Li raised her hand to stop him from saying what he wanted to say. She lowered her head and thought for a moment before saying, Feng San is indeed not Lei Jinting's match. Let's end it here today. This battle seemed intense, but in reality, neither side used their full strength. It was just a test. Qin Feng said, Our army has already fallen into the West Hills array. I fear it will not be so easy to get out. Princess, does Princess have a way to break the array? As if out of habit, Qin Feng looked hopefully at Yi Li. They had not followed Princess for long, but unconsciously, they all thought of Princess as an omnipotent genius. Yi Li shook her head and said with a smile, I really do not know much about arrays. Chapter 360. Hearing this, Qin Feng was slightly dejected. No matter how powerful Wang Fei was, she was only in her teens. How could she know everything? Many generals might not be able to study it thoroughly even after spending decades. This time, the ones remaining by Wang Fei's side were all young generals. The only experienced Marquis Nan had been sent out by Wang Fei to carry out other missions. Also, in Qin Feng's view, even if Marquis Nan was here, he would not be able to defeat Genom of Gojosian. Yi Li rubbed her fingers thoughtfully and smiled faintly. Since technology and intelligence cannot solve the problem, then we can only solve it with violence. Qin Feng stilled and did not understand Yi Li's meaning. He saw Yi Li slowly walk down the high platform and walk to Feng Xiao, who was watching the battle from the city wall. Before Qin Feng could think, a bright red flame rose into the sky with a sharp howl. Then an earth-shattering sound of horse hooves sounded from the southwest. Like a black tornado, it swept through the entire battlefield. At the same time, the Mahist army that had been split up by the Shilling army connected in an extremely short amount of time. They broke out from the enemy's belly and formed an even larger formation with their comrades around them. Like a sharp arrow, they drew a crack in the Shilling army's enormous formation. The Black Cloud cavalry that had just arrived did not remember to kill or leave. They moved back and forth on the battlefield and immediately tore the neat formation into pieces. After the Shilling army, where the middle army stood. The Shilling general looked at the sudden arrival of the Black Cloud cavalry and his expression changed. What kind of formation is this? Zhenan Wang withdrew the smile on his face. He thoughtfully looked at the distant city wall and said, This isn't a formation. In front of absolute power, any formation was just empty talk. The Mahist army was slightly stronger than the Shilling army. What they lacked was military strength and truly skilled generals. If they wanted to compete with the Mahist army, they were prepared to pay the price. At this moment, with the addition of the Black Cloud cavalry, the outcome was hard to predict. The general beside him suggested, should we let the army at the back press forward and completely annihilate the Mo army outside the city? The South Protecting King shook his head and said, It's too late. They are about to retreat. As expected, the sound of retreating echoed from the walls of Hangzhou City. The gates of Hangzhou City were instantly opened. Under the cover of the Black Cloud cavalry, the Mahist army that had just charged out of the Shilling army's protection charged into the city. The Black Cloud cavalry behind them also charged into the city. What greeted the pursuing West Hill soldiers was a rain of arrows from the Mahist army guarding the city. Seeing this scene, the generals around Genom of Gojosian began to curse one after another. The Eastern Chu people are truly despicable. They can't beat us, so they run. Genom of Gojosian was not angry, but instead laughed and said, "If they can't beat us, the most important thing is to run." However, Yi Li's actions made I understand one thing. In this Hangzhou city, there really isn't a general who can take on a big role. With just one Feng Zhiao, after a few more years of training, he might be able to take charge. Right now, he's too inexperienced. The generals thought, wasn't it so? The two sides had equal forces, but the Eastern Chu people needed the help of the Black Cloud cavalry to retreat into the city. If it wasn't because there was no one in the army, then what was? Mo Xiaoyao is fighting against 3 allied forces at the same time. No matter how strong Mo Xiaoyao is, he won't be able to do anything. I'm afraid that the Mahist army's generals have all followed Mo Xiaoyao into the pass. Isn't that so? Mo Xiaoyao actually handed the northwest to a woman. It can be seen that the Mahist army really has no one. While the generals were discussing, Genom of Gojoseon turned his gaze back to the light green figure on the walls of Hangzhou City. These days, the Mahist army's successive defeats and today's victory made the generals of West Hill look down on the Mahist army. However, as the commander, Genom of Gojoseon didn't. Not only that, it made him pay more attention to the young princess consort of Dinghua. These days, it was true that they had won in a row, but they didn't get any real benefits in Hangzhou. Along the way, all the ripe grains in the northwest had already been harvested. Even the few that couldn't be harvested had been burned to the ground. These days, the Mo family's army was said to be resisting, but it would be more accurate to say that they were obstructing them so that the people of Hangzhou could snatch the food. According to the information he received, Yi Li even sent the Mo family's army to help the people snatch the food. This invisibly increased his need to capture Hangzhou as soon as possible. In another month, the northwest would truly enter a severe winter. At that time, many places would be snowed and roads would be blocked. Even if there was grain, it might not be able to be transported over. On the other hand, it was impossible for their rations and military supplies to last until next spring. The closer they got to Hangzhou, the more Genom of Gojoseon had a hunch that the Mahist army deliberately led them to Hangzhou. But he couldn't understand the Mahist army or Yi Li's idea. Behind Hangzhou was the flat land of Guanyai. Judging from Yi Li's performance these days, it didn't seem like she had the strength to keep him out of Hangzhou City. The Mahist army didn't even have a master of strategy. In fact, Genom of Gojoseon didn't understand. He always thought that he valued Yi Li enough, but when he thought that there was no independent general in the Mahist army, it was already a kind of contempt. He also didn't think that Yi Li's goal wasn't to keep the Xiling army out of Hangzhou City, but to wipe out all 200,000 Xiling army in Hangzhou. Looking at the green-clothed woman on the city gate tower who seemed to nod at him, Genom of Gojoseon's heart suddenly skipped a beat. A strange sense of uneasiness instantly stunned his mind. But after repeatedly calculating, he still couldn't find the source of this uneasiness. After thinking for a while, Genom of Gojoseon turned around and returned to the camp. Quickly pass down the order. Order the 300,000 soldiers stationed at the border of Xiling to rush to Hangzhou as quickly as possible. The general following beside him was startled. He hesitated and said, "Prince, the speed of the army escorting the large amount of grain." The soldiers stationed at the border were carrying enough grain to last the entire winter for the 400,000 soldiers. If they wanted to transport it all the way to Hangzhou, their speed naturally wouldn't be fast. Genom of Gojoseon snorted softly and said, "It's fine as long as they can make it in time. If you are any slower, the army might have already arrived before you have taken Hangzhou City." The generals following him couldn't help but blush and show their dissatisfaction. If they couldn't even beat a woman, they wouldn't have the face to return to Xiling. "Within 5 days, we will definitely take Hangzhou. I will wait and see." In Hangzhou City, Feng Zhiao looked at Yi Li with a face full of sweat and said with a smile, "If Wang Fei hadn't made preparations today, the Mahist army that went out of the city to fight probably wouldn't have made it back. I am still too lacking." Yi Li looked at him with a smile and said, "Even though you have been on the battlefield since you were young, you haven't fought in many years. In terms of experience, compared to Genom of Gojoseon, who has been on the battlefield for half his life, you are naturally lacking. Today's lesson has taught us that it is best not to compare our weaknesses with other people's strengths. Feng Xiao helplessly spread out his hands and said, in a face-to-face battle, the best thing to do is to arrange troops and formations. If we directly let the soldiers charge in groups, we will die even worse. But Wang Fei is right. We will only be at a disadvantage if we fight like this. If the two armies are equal in strength, what is tested is formations. If it was back in the south, Mo Jingli's motley crew, who would care about formations? They could just charge in and scare those shrimp soldiers to death. Chapter 361. Yi Li was also helpless. The most experienced soldier in the army, Marquis Nan, was sent out by her. As for the others, they were probably not as good as Feng Xiao, who had been learning from Mo Xiaoyao since he was young. Even though she understood some of the meaning, for someone who was more familiar with modern warfare, it was very difficult to understand the essence of these ancient formations. No matter how many books on the art of war one read, it was useless if one could not truly integrate into the battlefield. Not everyone who read the 36 stratagems of Sun Tzu's Art of War could become a famous general. Lowering her head to think, Yi Li said, try to avoid fighting face to face like this. How are the preparations for the matter I mentioned a few days ago? Feng Xiao nodded and said, everything has been arranged according to Princess's wishes. Princess. After hesitating, Feng Xiao asked, there is nothing important in Hangzhou right now. Will Princess consider entering the pass first? Entering the pass. Yi Li raised her eyebrows and turned to look at Feng Xiao behind her. His young and handsome face was filled with worry. Yi Li shook her head and said, I can't leave Hangzhou right now. If I'm not in Hangzhou, Genom of Gojoseon might be able to detect our intentions. I'm here, to make him believe that the Mahist army will defend Hangzhou to the death. But, Feng Xiao said worriedly, if it was before, I wouldn't be worried. Even if we were caught in a chaotic battle, with Princess's abilities and Qi Lin, we would be able to escape safely. But now, if there is an accident. Although it could not be seen now, the princess consort was pregnant after all. The battlefield was constantly changing, and no one knew what would happen. Yi Li said in a low voice, other than that, send someone to send Han Mingyue and Su Zuodi away. As for Qi Lin, I have other uses for it. Feng Xiao's face darkened. He stood firmly in front of Yi Li and said, Qi Lin will be used to protect Wang Fei. Yi Li raised her head and looked at him. She frowned and said, this consort didn't train Qi Lin to be a bodyguard. Without them, the plan this time would have failed. Feng San, think carefully about the consequences of the several 100,000 Xiling army entering the pass before speaking to this consort again. After she finished speaking, she no longer paid any attention to Feng Xiao. Yi Li turned around and walked down the tower. Feng Xiao sighed helplessly. How could he not know what Wang Fei was thinking? Not to mention the Xiling army's invasion of the Central Plains, not to mention the damage to the Dechu state's territory caused by the Xiling army's invasion of the Central Plains, just the threat of the Mahist army in the Guanyi Pass alone was enough for them to do their best to stop these bandits outside Hangzhou city. But, no matter what, they could not let anything happen to Wang Fei. Feng Xiao simply didn't dare to imagine what kind of reaction Mo Xiaoyao would have if something happened to the princess consort. General Feng. The subordinate following behind him reminded him in a low voice. Feng Xiao rubbed his brows and said, increase the number of bodyguards by Wang Fei's side by 2 times. They don't have to do anything. Once Hangzhou city is breached, immediately escort Wang Fei out of the city. Yes. At this time, in the imperial city of Dechu State, the dazzling imperial palace was even colder and quieter than usual. In the imperial study, Mo Xiaoyao's expression was dark as he stared at the man kneeling on the ground. He said coldly, Mo Xiaoyao has turned to the Guanyi Pass and ordered Wang Fei to lead 200,000 soldiers to resist the Xiling Genom of Gojoseon. The man kneeling on the ground shuddered at the coldness in his voice. He said in a trembling voice, replying to your majesty, the news from the northwest is like this. Wang Fei led the Mahist army guarding the northwest and retreated to Hangzhou. I'm afraid she plans to have a decisive battle with the Xiling army near Hangzhou. Several generals near Hangzhou and the Guanyi Pass have submitted petitions to support Wang Fei. Shut up. Mo Jingqi said coldly. Because of his rapid breathing, his chest was heaving up and down. Supporting Ding Wang Fei. After winning this battle, would Ding Wang Fei gain the reputation of not losing out to men? After so many years, he had finally crippled Mo Xiaoyao. Who would have thought that not only did he stand up again, he even had a Wang Fei who could fight? Yi Li. Mo Jingqi regretted countless times in his heart. Why did he marry Yi Li to Mo Xiaoyao back then? Suddenly, he thought of something. How is the situation of the Su family in Yunzhou? The kneeling official's heart tightened. He secretly glanced at the emperor and carefully said, "The Su family. Old Master Qing Yun and Master Hong Yu are still teaching at Lishan Academy. There is nothing strange." His heart beat wildly. He suddenly had a feeling that the high and mighty emperor might have gone crazy. The Su family was the head of the world's scholars. If it was a peaceful time, it would be fine. But now, the Chu state was filled with internal and external troubles. The emperor actually wanted to make a move against the Su family. It had to be known, at least half of the world's officials were Master Qing Yun's students. Furthermore, the Su family had no evidence that the emperor could use against them. Mo Jingqi was silent for a long time before he finally spoke. "We understand. You may leave. Your Majesty, the Guanyi Pass generals petitions for battle, petitions for battle." Mo Jingqi's cold voice made one's heart turn cold. "You may leave. We will deal with it. This official will leave." Inside the imperial study, Mo Jingqi sat on the high throne. His expression was dark and gloomy. After a long time, he finally spoke. "Tell Marquis Muyang to immediately enter the palace to see us." The servants in the imperial study knew that the emperor's mood was not good. They did not dare to say anything and quickly turned to leave. Marquis Muyang came quickly. In fact, ever since his only beloved son followed consort Ding to the battlefield, he had not been at ease. Even the news of the Marquis Nan manor, which had always been at odds with him, being raided and the Marquis Nan and his son dying an unnatural death did not make him feel at ease. The Marquis Muyang manor was absolutely loyal to the emperor. It was because of this that Muyang followed Princess Ding to the battlefield. Although he had received 2 letters from Muyang asking for his safety, what was the use? The northwest was thousands of miles away from the capital. If something really happened, by the time the emperor sent people over, his son's corpse would have rotted away. More importantly, Marquis Muyang understood the young emperor's personality very well. His paranoia was rare in the world. These days, Muyang did not report any news that was unfavorable to the Prince Ding mansion. This was definitely not in line with the emperor's original intention. At that time, the emperor might even suspect that Muyang was colluding with the Prince Ding mansion. At that time, the Marquis Nan manor would be the example of the Marquis Muyang manor. Therefore, after receiving the news from the servants, Marquis Muyang only tidied up a little. He did not dare to delay and entered the palace to see the emperor. This official greets the emperor. Stepping into the imperial study, Marquis Muyang saw the emperor's gloomy expression. His heart trembled. He did not delay and knelt on the ground to greet him. He was obviously very satisfied with Marquis Muyang's respect. His gloomy expression eased a little. "My beloved official, you may rise." Mo Jingqi hated the fact that his officials had special rights and treatment. For example, the Ding mansion. He had cursed more than once in his heart for the decree that his ancestors had passed down to the previous generations of Prince Ding and Princess Ding not to kneel in front of the emperor. They were all his officials. Why did the Ding mansion's people not have to kneel? For example, there were old officials above the age of 70 who were given the grace of not having to kneel in the palace. However, none of the old officials, including Duke Hua who had outstanding military achievements, had ever received this grace. Mo Jingqi enjoyed the feeling of all the servants kneeling in front of him. Chapter 362. Thank you, Your Majesty. May I know what instructions Your Majesty has for me? Marquis Muyang stood up and asked respectfully. Mo Jingqi did not say anything. Instead, he stared at Marquis Muyang thoughtfully. Although Marquis Muyang was anxious and worried, he did not dare to show it on his face. Instead, his expression became more and more respectful. After a long time, he heard Mo Jingqi ask in a deep voice, "Have you received your son's letter of safety?" Marquis Muyang quickly replied, "Your Majesty, I have received it. The most recent one was half a month ago." "Oh? What did the letter say?" Mo Jingqi asked lightly. "My son only reported his safety and mentioned that Prince Ding had already rushed to Xinyang to join forces with Princess Ding. I think, the reclaiming of the Northwest is just around the corner," Marquis Muyang said. Actually, how could Mo Jingqi not know what the letter said? Looking at the trembling Marquis Muyang, Mo Jingqi suddenly smiled and said, "Don't be nervous, Mu Qing. Muyang too, only wrote 2 letters after such a long time. Aren't you afraid that your father will be worried at home? Do you know where Muyang is now?" Marquis Muyang said cautiously, "I don't know. It's just that my son went to war with the army. He should be in front of Prince Ding's army right now." Mo Jingqi snorted, "That's right. Prince Ding is now leading 500,000 Mahist army and fighting against Nanzhao, Xiling and Prince Li's army. Your son is the vanguard." Marquis Muyang's heart skipped a beat. Looking at the emperor's face, he pretended to be shocked and asked, "Your Majesty, is that so, the northwest outside the pass?" Mo Jingqi smiled, "Northwest. The Northwest Princess Ding personally led 200,000 troops to fight against Genom of Gojoseon. Now, they have retreated to Hongzhou. Mu Qing, take a look at this," Mo Jingqi said as he pointed at a few memorials on the table. Marquis Muyang thanked the emperor and took a look at the memorials. It was a request for war from the various garrisons near the northwest. Although there was a fierce battle going on inside the pass, the garrison troops all over the country had received orders to stay where they were and not to move rashly. As a result, the generals could only watch as Prince Ding fought with the allied army, unable to move. Although they didn't dare to say anything on the surface, anyone with a bit of courage would inevitably be somewhat dissatisfied with this secret decree. Thus, it was not unexpected that these generals would request to come out of seclusion to assist Princess Ding. However, the emperor was clearly very dissatisfied with this. Marquis Muyang chose his words carefully and said, "Your Majesty, the generals are also patriotic. After all, the Northwest is a part of Dechu State and is Your Majesty's territory. This is also their loyalty to Your Majesty." Mo Jingqi didn't really doubt the loyalty of these generals. He looked at Marquis Muyang and said, "Mu Qing, who do you think is more suitable to lead the troops into battle?" This. Marquis Muyang clearly didn't expect the emperor to agree to the plan to assist Princess Ding so easily. For a moment, he couldn't react and quickly said, "Naturally it is Your Majesty's wise decision." Mo Jingqi stared at him and said, "Jin wants someone absolutely trustworthy to handle this matter." For some reason, Marquis Muyang suddenly felt that something was wrong. Under Mo Jingqi's gaze, he forced himself to maintain a calm expression and said with a smile, "There are many officials in the court who are loyal to Your Majesty. Why would Your Majesty worry about not having enough people? This humble subject is willing to lead the troops into battle." Mo Jingqi smiled with satisfaction and looked at Marquis Muyang, "That's good. My beloved subject won't be here tomorrow morning. You can quickly head to the northwest tonight. The troops from the 2 provinces closest to the northwest will be under your command." Marquis Muyang forced a smile and said, "Thank you, Your Majesty. This subject will not disappoint Your Majesty. I swear to expel the enemy and pacify the northwest." Mo Jingqi's eyes turned cold and said lightly, "Mu Qing's ambition is comforting. But Jin still has one more thing to instruct my beloved subject." Marquis Muyang only felt his heart beat faster. His intuition told him that it was best not to listen to the emperor's next words. But the reality was that he could only stand in the hall more respectfully and said, "Please instruct me, Your Majesty." The voice in the hall lowered. After a long time, an inconspicuous eunuch came out from the side hall. He carefully looked around and saw that there was no one around. He quickly turned and flew towards the Empress's palace. No matter what happened elsewhere, the battle in Hangzhou was still ongoing. Genom of Gojosian seemed to have finally lost his patience with the situation in front of him. He continued to attack every day and the night attacks became more and more intense. The small-scale attacks of the Mahist army could not stop the determination and footsteps of the Xiling army. What was comforting was that Imo Hua finally led the Shadow Guard to Hangzhou. This caused Feng Zhiao, who had always been worried about Yi Li's Shadow Guard, to finally sigh in relief. Facing Genom of Gojosian's increasingly fierce attacks, the destruction of Hangzhou city could be foreseen. "Wang Fei, please leave Hangzhou immediately." Mo Hua still had an expressionless expression as he looked seriously at the woman who was bent over the table and writing. But if one looked closely, one could see that there was a complicated gaze of admiration and worry in those eyes. In the past, Mo Hua had been dissatisfied and disapproving of Yi Li's intentions to change the Shadow Guard. Even though he had some understanding of her abilities, but that was it. But when he came to Hangzhou, he learned that this elegant and graceful woman who calmly guarded the northwest was pregnant. Mo Hua was finally convinced. This Princess Ding was definitely different from any other woman in the world. Because of this, he had to ensure the safety of Princess Ding. No matter if it was for the prince or the future Shitzi, or simply because he did not want to see anything happen to this extraordinary woman. Yi Li nodded and said, "I know. I will leave in 3 days." According to her calculations, Hangzhou city could at most hold on for 3 more days. 3 days later, the West Hill people would attack Hangzhou city. At the same time, it would also be the day they were completely destroyed. A trace of anger flashed through Yi Li's eyes. She calmly put down the brush in her hand. Mo Hua was silent for a moment before saying, "The Shadow Guard has people who are skilled in disguise. They can disguise themselves as Wang Fei and stay in Hangzhou." Yi Li helplessly shook her head and said, "Do you think this can escape the eyes of Westhill Genom of Gojosian?" "Mo Hua, you don't have to worry. I will leave Hangzhou before then." Lowering her head, Yi Li gently stroked her still flat stomach. A trace of melancholy rose in her heart. No matter what, for the unborn child, she could not put herself in danger, even though she actually hoped to stay and defend Hangzhou city with the Mahist army. Seeing Yi Li stand up and turn to the bookshelf behind her, clearly having no intention of saying anything more, Mo Hua understood that she could not persuade her and could only helplessly retreat. On the road north from the Guanyi to Hangzhou, a few horses were quietly grazing in a forest. Beside a bonfire not far away, Mo Xiaoyao's handsome face was slightly dark. From time to time, his handsome brows furrowed. "Prince, a secret letter from the capital." Jin walked over and hurriedly delivered a letter sealed with red wax. Mo Xiaoyao's eyes flashed. He took the letter and opened it. The contents of the letter caused his expression to change. Standing to the side, Jin couldn't help but take a step back. He had been by the prince's side for more than a decade. In Jin's memory, the prince's expression had never been so ugly. "Prince, the capital, what happened in the capital?" After a long time, he heard Mo Xiaoyao grit his teeth and say, "Mo Jingqi." Jin's heart jumped. He was not an intelligent person and did not understand many of the twists and turns. But this did not prevent him from understanding that the relationship between the emperor and his prince was not as good as the common people thought. Had the emperor done something to provoke the prince? You're tuning into the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.